My name is Megan Caldwell. I'm 29 years old, and this happened in early spring along the Gunflint Trail near the boundary waters of Minnesota. A time when winter's icy grip still clings to the land even as nature tentatively awakens. I had just left behind a painful divorce and a life that felt too crowded with memories. So I rented an old, weathered RV to seek solace in the solitude of the wilderness. I hoped that the quiet, the raw beauty of the landscape, and a little creative inspiration for my blog would help me piece together the fragments of my broken heart. The journey began on a cool, overcast morning. As I drove the creaking RV along the scenic Gunflint Trail, my thoughts wandered between bittersweet memories and the fragile hope of renewal. The road wound through dense forests and alongside shimmering lakes, with the landscape shifting from the stark, lingering shadows of winter to the tentative greens of a new season. Despite the beauty, there was an undercurrent of unease that I couldn't quite shake. Perhaps it was the isolation, or maybe it was the way the trees seemed to whisper secrets to those who dared to listen. About halfway through my drive, the RV began to sputter on a narrow, winding road. My heart sank as I pulled over. The engine coughed and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I spent the better part of a day waiting for help, huddled in the dim interior of the RV as the temperature dipped and the silence grew heavy. It wasn't just the malfunctioning engine or the unreliable heater. It was the sense that I had been abandoned by modern convenience in a place where nature ruled and technology faltered. A kindly trucker named Hank eventually pulled over to lend a hand. With his grizzled face and weather-beaten cap, Hank spoke in soft, cryptic tones as he helped me secure a temporary fix. "This trail's got secrets, miss," he warned. "You best be careful, 'cause sometimes the past and the present don't mix too well out here." His words, delivered with a knowing glint in his eye, only deepened the uneasy feeling that had begun to nestle in my chest. Once the RV was running again, I resumed my journey to a secluded lakeside campsite that I'd heard about from a local diner owner named Ruth. Her small-town diner was my only stop for fuel and food, and when I asked about the area, she hesitated before finally telling me a few hushed details. "There's an old logging camp round here," Ruth said softly, her eyes lowering as if to guard a secret. "Years ago, there was a terrible accident, and some folks say there were rituals too. Occult practices meant to contain something that just wouldn't rest. And sometimes on quiet nights you might see a little one dancing by the tree line. Not a child you'd expect, mind you. The kind that's been caught between worlds." Her words, mysterious and laced with sorrow, echoed in my mind as I finally pulled into the campsite. The campsite was exactly as I had envisioned. A solitary patch of land bordered by towering pines and overlooking a still, mirror-like lake. Setting up my few belongings around the RV, I couldn't help but notice small, inexplicable objects arranged near the entrance. Smooth stones lined up in a perfect row, a piece of driftwood that resembled a tiny figure, and faint, childlike drawings scratched into the dirt. The drawings were crude but haunting, as if made by small, trembling hands, trying to leave a mark in a place where time itself seemed to have forgotten. That night, as the sky deepened into a velvety black and the stars emerged timidly from behind wisps of cloud, I settled into the cramped interior of the RV. I turned on a small lamp and began typing notes into my blog, detailing the day's journey and my hopes for the solitude to bring clarity. But just as I was beginning to feel the peace I'd sought, I started to hear soft, almost musical whispers outside. At first, it sounded like the wind rustling through the leaves, but gradually it became apparent that the sounds were more deliberate. Whispers of laughter that reminded me of a child's giggle, yet tinged with a sorrow that set my nerves on edge. Unable to ignore the persistent murmur, I stepped outside. The air was cold and a fine mist had begun to settle over the campsite. I scanned the darkness with my flashlight, catching fleeting glimpses of a small, pale figure at the edge of the tree line. It was brief, a mere flash between the trees, and when I blinked, it was gone. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Had it been a trick of the light or something else entirely? I resolved to keep a careful watch, even as a part of me yearned to dismiss the disturbance as a byproduct of my own loneliness and recent emotional turmoil. Over the next few days, I set about trying to document the quiet beauty of the wilderness with my camera and blog. But the unsettling presence around my campsite grew ever more pronounced. Each morning, I would discover new arrangements of small objects near my RV. Pebbles stacked in unusual patterns, leaves arranged in circles, and once, even a small faded ribbon that looked strikingly familiar, like a remnant of a forgotten childhood toy. The drawings in the dirt began to appear more frequently, their lines and shapes forming patterns that suggested a story, though I couldn't decipher it. Driven by a mix of curiosity and an increasing sense of dread, I decided to investigate the area around the campsite. One cloudy afternoon, armed with my camera, a notebook, and a healthy dose of trepidation, I ventured into the dense woods. The forest here was ancient and somber, the trees standing like silent sentinels over a land steeped in history and sorrow. I followed a narrow path that led me deeper into the heart of the wilderness, each step taking me further from the relative safety of the RV. After what felt like hours of walking, I stumbled upon the remnants of an old logging camp. Rusted tools, broken signs, and decaying wooden structures hinted at a once thriving community that had long since been swallowed by the relentless advance of nature. My heart tightened as I noticed a dilapidated cabin tucked away behind a copse of trees. The building, covered in moss and partly reclaimed by the forest, exuded an aura of desolation and mystery. I knew that this was the place Ruth had alluded to, the abandoned logging camp with its dark, tragic history. Inside the cabin, I found faded photographs of men and women whose eyes seemed to speak of loss and desperation. Alongside the photographs lay a stack of handwritten notes and documents, yellowed with age. As I carefully sifted through them, I pieced together a narrative of a catastrophic logging accident that had claimed many lives. The workers, desperate and afraid, had turned to occult practices in a misguided attempt to ward off further tragedy. Their rituals, meant to contain the malevolent force they believed had been unleashed, had instead bound a restless spirit to the land. In the quiet of the cabin, as I read the fragile words of those long gone, I felt a stirring of recognition within me. The tragedy, the unresolved grief, and the lingering presence of a lost childhood echoed my own inner turmoil. I recalled the soft giggles and the fleeting glimpse of a spectral child at my campsite, and a chill ran down my spine. Was it possible that the ghost I had been encountering was not just a remnant of the logging camp's sorrowful past, but also a manifestation of my own buried pain, a symbol of the innocence I'd lost along with my marriage? That night, back at the RV, the atmosphere grew almost unbearably tense. The temperature plummeted, and the RV's lights flickered as if protesting against an unseen force. I could hear the soft patter of little footsteps outside, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of a child's laughter. Summoning all my courage, I stepped outside once more. In the pale glow of my flashlight, I saw the ghostly figure again. A small child, in old-fashioned clothes, its eyes wide and filled with a pleading sorrow. The apparition moved slowly, almost hesitantly, as if unsure whether to approach or retreat. I called out softly, "Hello?" But the child did not respond, merely turning to beckon me further into the darkness of the woods. My heart raced as I hesitated at the edge of the campsite. the ghost child seemed to be guiding me, leading me back to the abandoned cabin. I followed the spectral figure, my footsteps crunching on frost-laden leaves. The further I ventured from the safety of the RV, the more the supernatural presence seemed to intensify. Whispers, indistinct but filled with emotion, brushed past me like cool tendrils of air. It was as though the spirit was trying to communicate, to share its burden of sorrow and regret. At the cabin, the ghost child halted before a hidden compartment in the floor. Trembling, I knelt and pried open the compartment to reveal a small collection of documents and personal effects. Among them were diaries, photographs, and letters that detailed the harrowing events leading up to the logging disaster. The entries spoke of betrayal, fear, and desperate attempts to summon protective forces through occult rituals. One entry, written in a shaky hand, described a ritual meant to appease a malevolent spirit that had been haunting the camp. A spirit that might have been inadvertently called forth by the grief and guilt of those who had perished. As I read the faded words by the light of my flashlight, the ghost child stood silently nearby, its expression a mixture of longing and relief. In that moment, I realized that this was not a mere haunting. It was a call for remembrance and healing. The ghost was not malevolent in a traditional sense. It did not seek to harm but to bridge a gap between the past and the present, to force the living to confront the unresolved sorrows that had festered in this cursed place. The days that followed became a blur of intense emotions and eerie phenomena. The ghost child appeared more frequently, sometimes in the periphery of my vision, other times directly in front of me. The RV, once a refuge, now felt like a cage that separated me from the truth I was desperate to uncover. I began documenting everything: photographs of the cabin, scans of the documents, and my own journal entries capturing every inexplicable occurrence. Late one night, as I sat by the RV's window watching the interplay of shadow and light on the trees, I felt a profound connection to the sorrow that had permeated this land. It was as if the ghost child was not only a messenger from the past, but also a mirror reflecting my own inner struggles. In that fragile moment of clarity, I knew that the key to both my healing and the spirit's peace lay in acknowledging and honoring the memories of those who had been lost. The ritual described in the recovered documents required an offering, a symbol of what was most dear to one's heart. For me, that offering was the creative spirit I had nearly lost in the depths of my grief. With trembling resolve, I gathered the items I had collected and prepared a quiet memorial by the cabin. I lit a small candle, placed a few cherished mementos on a makeshift altar, and recited a passage from one of the diaries, a prayer of remembrance and forgiveness. As I spoke the words aloud, the air around me seemed to shimmer, and the ghost child stepped forward, its presence now imbued with an air of gentle acceptance. The oppressive chill began to lift, replaced by a sense of bittersweet tranquility. I felt as though the past was finally being acknowledged, its pain transformed into a quiet, enduring hope. In the days that followed, the supernatural disturbances lessened. The ghost child no longer appeared with the same urgency, and the inexplicable arrangements of objects around the RV gradually stopped. I resumed my daily routine, now enriched by a newfound understanding of the interconnectedness of loss, memory, and healing. The documents from the cabin became the cornerstone of a series of blog posts that explored the tragic history of the logging camp, the occult rituals, and the human emotions that had bound everyone to that cursed place. I left the Gunflint Trail with a heart that, while still scarred, had begun to mend. The experience had been one of deep introspection and unexpected catharsis. I understood that the ghosts we encounter are not always malevolent invaders of our peace. Sometimes, they are the lingering echoes of our own inner demons, calling out for acknowledgement and release. Driving away in my RV on that overcast afternoon, I felt an odd mix of relief and melancholy. The landscape rolled by in a haze of ever-changing colors, and though I had left behind the physical remnants of the haunted past, I carried with me a sense of closure. I had confronted the sorrow that had haunted this place, and, in doing so, had begun to heal the wounds that had long festered within me. Even now, whenever I travel alone through quiet, remote roads or pause by a placid lake to reflect, I sometimes hear a faint, distant laughter, a child's giggle mingling with the rustling of leaves. It is a reminder that the past is never truly gone, that its memories linger in the places we leave behind. But I also know that by facing these echoes, by honoring the lost and the broken, we can find our way toward healing and renewal. My name is Megan Caldwell. I'm 29 years old, and my journey on the Gunflint Trail was not just a solitary escape. It was a pilgrimage to reclaim a part of myself that I thought had been lost forever. In the quiet depths of the wilderness, I learned that every ghost, every whisper in the wind, carries a story. And sometimes those stories lead us back to the most important truth of all, that healing begins when we dare to remember, to forgive, and to let go. As I continue on my path, I carry the lessons of that haunting with me, a constant reminder that the shadows we encounter are often the guides that lead us into the light. My name is Carter. I'm 45. And this all happened in the autumn of 2022, when I decided to escape the constant reminders of a past I could no longer outrun. I rented an old RV, a battered relic that I'd managed to secure on a whim, and drove north to Itasca State Park in Minnesota, hoping that solitude by a quiet lake and endless forests would grant me the peace I desperately craved. I'd been grappling with a deep-seated grief and guilt for years, shadows of a tragedy that had shattered my life. The weight of my mistakes, of opportunities lost and words left unsaid, had driven me into isolation. I imagined that a few days in nature would help me piece together some kind of redemption, or at least offer a temporary reprieve from my inner torment. The drive was long and solitary. With only the hum of the engine and my own thoughts for company, I felt the miles slowly peel away the veneer of my old life. The autumn landscape outside my window was breathtaking. Vibrant hues of red, orange, and gold danced against the dark silhouettes of towering pines. Yet, as the scenery passed by, a subtle unease began to stir within me. I couldn't pinpoint it, but there was something about the isolation of the road that made every shadow and every whisper of wind seem imbued with a secret intent. I arrived at a secluded clearing by a lake that locals said was steeped in mystery. The air felt heavy, almost as if it were saturated with memories and long-forgotten sorrow. I chose a spot right by the water's edge, where the surface of the lake reflected the overhanging trees like a dark mirror. I unloaded the few supplies I'd managed to gather, a couple of tins of food, a few bottles of water, and a stack of old notebooks I carried for writing, and set up camp beside my RV. That first evening, I sat outside the RV watching the sun dip below the horizon. The lake, once a shimmering promise of solace, now looked like a portal to some unknown abyss. I felt the chill of the evening settle into my bones as I fumbled with the RV's outdated heater, which coughed to life with sputters and groans. I was alone, yet the silence around me was anything but peaceful. There were sounds, faint echoes that might have been the call of a loon or the rustle of wind through the leaves. But sometimes, amidst the natural chorus of the night, I thought I heard something that resembled laughter. It was soft, almost childlike, but laced with an eerie quality that sent a shiver down my spine. The first night passed in a restless blur. I tried to settle into sleep, but a persistent unease kept my eyes wide open. At times, I caught fleeting reflections in the darkened windows of the RV, shapes that weren't mine, fleeting images that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. I told myself it was my imagination, fueled by isolation and the persistent hum of my own guilt. Yet, as dawn crept in and painted the sky in hues of gray and pink, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. The next morning, I discovered that the RV's generator had failed completely overnight. My phone and the small digital clock by my bedside were rendered useless, their screens dark and unresponsive. I sighed, realizing that I was now even more isolated, not just from society but from any reliable source of modern convenience. With no way to call for help should I need it, I was left with only my own wits and a deep-seated hope that nature would somehow offer a remedy for my inner turmoil. I decided to take a walk along a narrow, winding trail that skirted the edge of the lake. The crisp air was both refreshing and biting, and the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot served as a steady, grounding rhythm. As I walked, I noticed more unsettling details. A series of odd reflections in a puddle, images that flickered like broken memories. A fleeting glimpse of a figure in the distance that vanished when I tried to focus on it. I told myself it was just the play of light and shadow, but a small part of me, an echo of long-buried fear, whispered that there was more to these sightings than mere trickery of the eye. By mid-afternoon, as I made my way back to the RV, I began hearing sounds that were impossible to ignore. The wind seemed to carry disembodied voices, murmuring words I couldn't quite understand. At times, I caught the soft, eerie laughter of a child on the breeze, a sound that was both innocent and profoundly unsettling. My heart pounded as I quickened my pace, desperate to return to the relative safety of my temporary sanctuary. Inside the RV, I found more evidence that something was amiss. The interior, already dim and musty, now felt charged with a presence that I couldn't shake. The old, stained windows reflected not only the interior of the RV, but, if I dared to look closely, an indistinct shape standing just behind me. I spun around, but the RV was empty. I told myself it was the combination of fatigue and isolation playing tricks on my mind, yet I couldn't dismiss the creeping dread that I was not alone. That night, as darkness swallowed the clearing, the supernatural presence began to assert itself in more undeniable ways. I had barely managed to doze off when a sudden cold gust of wind burst through the RV, extinguishing the feeble light of my lantern. In the oppressive silence that followed, I heard footsteps, light, deliberate steps that circled the outside of the RV. I froze, every muscle tensed, as I strained to listen. The sound was rhythmic, almost taunting, and it left me with a sense of impending doom. In the pitch black, I fumbled for my flashlight and hesitantly stepped outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar surroundings in stark relief. But then I saw it, a figure in the distance, standing at the edge of the trees, watching. It was impossible to tell if it was human, for the figure was shrouded in shadow. My breath caught in my throat as I recalled the old tales I'd read about cursed lands and haunted places. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the night. The figure did not move, simply watched with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I hurried back into the RV, locking the door behind me. For hours, I sat in silence, my mind racing with possibilities. Had I truly seen a ghost? Or was this another manifestation of the guilt and grief that had plagued me for so long? Sleep eluded me, replaced by a waking nightmare of restless thoughts and fear. The following day I ventured out again, determined to confront whatever it was that haunted this place. I visited a small weathered building at the edge of the campsite, a ranger station long abandoned and rumored to house relics of the park's past. Inside, amidst dusty shelves and faded photographs, I discovered a tattered journal. The entries were dated decades ago, written by someone who had once found solace in these woods, only to be tormented by inexplicable visions and an ever-present shadow that seemed to mirror their every move. One entry in particular caught my eye, a description of a spectral doppelganger, a manifestation of the writer's own guilt and sorrow, a ghostly figure that grew stronger with each unaddressed regret. The realization sent a chill through me. I had always thought of my own inner demons as abstract internal struggles. But what if they were manifesting here, in the physical realm? What if my own guilt was taking on a life of its own, a spectral doppelganger born from the darkness of my soul? That night, as I sat by the dying embers of a small fire, I resolved to face whatever had been following me. I scribbled down notes in my journal, trying to articulate the fear that had been building within me. I recalled every odd reflection, every inexplicable sound, and every moment of that creeping dread that had followed me since I arrived. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, I saw it, a dark silhouette that mirrored my every movement. I froze, my pen clattering to the ground as I stared at the vague outline of a figure that moved in perfect unison with me. It was as though I were looking at my own reflection in a warped mirror, but this image bore an expression of anguish and malevolence that I could not recognize as my own. I stumbled back, my heart pounding so fiercely I thought it might burst. The apparition didn't speak, it simply existed, a constant, unnerving presence that was as real as the cold night air. For hours, I sat in terrified silence, watching as the doppelganger's form shifted and swayed, its features flickering between my own and something far darker. I knew then that this was no mere trick of the light or the product of my fatigued mind. This was the manifestation of my inner guilt, a physical embodiment of the unresolved grief and shame that had haunted me for years. The days that followed were a blur of fear and introspection. Every time I stepped outside the RV, I could feel its eyes upon me, watching, waiting. The forest itself seemed to echo my torment, the rustle of leaves and the murmur of the wind transforming into accusatory whispers. I began to understand that this place was not cursed in a conventional sense. It was a mirror, reflecting the deepest corners of my soul, forcing me to confront the pain I had long tried to bury. Desperation led me to try and break the cycle. I scoured the abandoned ranger station for any further clues or rituals that might help me exorcise this haunting presence. I found more entries in the journal detailing a long-forgotten indigenous ritual, a method to appease a malevolent spirit that preyed on those burdened by guilt. According to the writings, the only way to dispel such a presence was to confront it head-on, to acknowledge the weight of one's misdeeds, and offer a sincere act of repentance. Armed with this fragile hope, I prepared for what I knew would be the most harrowing confrontation of my life. Under the light of a full, unforgiving moon, I gathered what little offerings I could find, small tokens of nature, a handful of wild herbs, a smooth weathered stone, and a scrap of fabric from an old jacket I'd kept as a memento of a happier time. I returned to the lake's edge, where the water lay dark and still, mirroring the turbulent sky above. I arranged the offerings in a small circle on the ground, directly in front of where I had first seen the doppelganger. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the words I had pieced together from the journal, words that spoke of acknowledgement, sorrow, and forgiveness. The wind picked up as if on cue, swirling around me in a dance of restless leaves and unseen whispers. I began the incantation, my voice barely more than a quiver in the vast, indifferent night. As I spoke, the temperature dropped sharply, and the presence of the doppelganger grew overwhelming. I could see it emerging from the shadows, its form more distinct now, a dark echo of myself, its eyes filled with a profound sadness and rage. For a moment it stood there, silent and accusing, as if daring me to continue. The lake rippled gently, the only sound the soft lapping of water against the shore, contrasting sharply with the storm of emotions within me. I continued, each word a desperate plea for redemption. I admitted my faults, my regrets, and the burdens I had carried alone for far too long. With every confession, the doppelganger's form wavered, its edges blurring as though struggling against an invisible tide. In that intense moment, I felt the full weight of my past, the faces of those I'd hurt, the opportunities squandered, the love I had lost, and I wept openly, letting the raw sorrow pour out of me. For what felt like an eternity, the confrontation between my inner demon and my own voice echoed across the still lake. Then, as if my confession had broken a long-held curse, the doppelganger's aggressive stance softened. Its eyes, once burning with a malevolent light, dimmed to a sorrowful gaze. Slowly, inexorably it began to fade, dissolving into the night as the oppressive chill lifted and the wind quieted to a gentle murmur. I stood there alone at the lake's edge, heart pounding and tears still streaming down my face. In that moment, I felt a strange liberation, a release from the burden that had haunted me for so long. The curse had been broken not by banishing the specter, but by confronting and accepting the dark truths within myself. In the days that followed, I remained at the camp, unsure if the haunting presence had truly vanished, or if it was merely lying dormant, waiting for another moment of weakness. Each morning, the mist over the lake would gradually recede, and I would try to retrace my steps, both physically and emotionally, back to a version of myself that felt whole. I spent long hours writing in my journal, recording every detail of that fateful night, and every emotion that had surged through me like a tidal wave. As the RV's unreliable engine coughed its way back to life, I knew it was time to leave this place of painful introspection. I packed up my meager belongings, leaving behind the circle of offerings and the silent lake that had borne witness to my confession. Driving away from Atasca State Park was both a relief and a lingering sorrow, the sense that I had finally faced my demons, yet also that the memories of that night would forever be etched into the fabric of my being. Even now, months later, I find echoes of that confrontation in quiet moments. A reflection in a window might briefly show a shadow that isn't entirely mine, or a whisper in the wind might remind me of the childlike laughter that once chilled me to the bone. But those echoes no longer hold the power to terrify me. Instead, they serve as a reminder of the fragile, painful process of healing, of the day I stepped into the void of my own guilt and emerged with the strength to move forward. I share this story not as a triumph over darkness, but as an acknowledgement that sometimes the most profound horrors we face are not external monsters, but the internal specters born of our own mistakes. My journey to Atasca State Park was one of solitude and reflection, of confronting a manifestation of my own sorrow until it lost its hold over me. In that remote corner of Minnesota, amid the silent trees and dark waters, I found not just a ghostly doppelganger, but a pathway to redemption. Now, as I navigate the complexities of everyday life, I carry with me the memory of that moonlit night, a night when the boundaries between the supernatural and the deeply personal blurred into one. The forest, with all its whispered secrets and timeless grief, taught me that confronting the past is the only way to break free of it. And while the echoes in the void may still whisper on quiet nights, I no longer fear them, for I know that they are merely the remnants of a pain I have faced and a darkness I have finally allowed myself to forgive. This was my journey, a solitary sojourn in a haunted wilderness that forced me to confront the darkest corners of my soul. It was a night of fear and revelation, of ghostly apparitions and the painful truth of who I had become. And as I continue on my path, I remain grateful for that harsh, unyielding lesson. That sometimes the only way to find peace is to stare into the void, embrace the shadows within, and let the echoes fade into the light of a new day. My name is Megan Lawson. I'm 34, and this is the story of the most harrowing autumn of my life. A journey that began with a desperate need to escape the chaos of modern living and ended in a nightmare I still struggle to comprehend. It all started on a crisp October morning as my 3 closest friends and I loaded up our old RV for a much-needed retreat into the wilds of northern Minnesota, deep in the Superior National Forest near the Gunflint Trail. We were drawn by the lure of serene lakes, ancient pines, and the possibility of uncovering secrets hidden in the backwoods. I had always been a nature lover, and my curiosity had led me to study the history and legends of the region. I knew about the Ojibwe stories, the warnings about greed and hunger giving birth to unspeakable evil, and the dark myth of the Wendigo, a creature born of starvation and cursed souls. I never truly believed until that autumn when reality and myth blurred into a terror I could neither escape nor rationalize away. We were 4. Jake Thompson, a cautious yet anxious man of 38 who had meticulously planned every detail of our trip. Riley Carter, a fearless 29-year-old whose impulsiveness often bordered on recklessness. And Sarah McKenna, our 32-year-old voice of reason whose analytical mind fought hard to defy the creeping dread that began to settle over us. I, as the mediator, tried to keep the group together, even as tensions began to simmer beneath the surface. The RV, a relic of better times, was far from perfect. It was a decade old, with a malfunctioning heater and a battery that gave us more headaches than comfort. Our outdated maps and spotty cell reception added to the mounting sense of isolation, but we pressed on, determined to find solace in the wilderness. Our destination was a secluded spot on the edge of Lake Vermilion, where the trees whispered ancient secrets and the water reflected the tumultuous sky. The journey started lightheartedly enough. We joked about our urban woes and imagined ourselves as modern-day explorers. Yet, even in the early hours, something felt off. As we pulled off onto a narrow, gravel road, I noticed unusual tracks along the roadside, elongated prints that were too large and strangely shaped to belong to any local wildlife. I mentioned it to Jake, who frowned and promised to check the RV's equipment again, but the sense of foreboding was already seeping into my bones. That first night, as darkness swallowed the landscape, an eerie stillness took hold. I sat on the back steps of the RV, trying to calm my racing thoughts, when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound that could only be described as the distant laughter of children. It was an odd, disembodied giggling that echoed through the woods, so out of place in the silence of the forest. I shrugged it off as the wind playing tricks, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, while Riley and Sarah ventured out for a short hike to explore the nearby trails, Jake and I inspected the RV. As we moved along a narrow path near the campsite, we stumbled upon strange carvings on the trunks of ancient pine trees. The markings were crude but deliberate, symbols that looked uncannily similar to Ojibwe warning glyphs I'd read about. I traced a finger over one of the carvings, feeling a chill shoot up my arm. It was as if the trees themselves were trying to communicate a message of dire warning. We took photos, hoping to show them to someone later, but deep down, I feared that our intrusion had stirred something long dormant. That afternoon, the group reconvened, and I couldn't help but mention the carvings. Riley, always the adventurer, laughed it off, suggesting that we had just found a forgotten piece of local art. But Jake's face was tight with worry, and Sarah's eyes revealed a creeping anxiety that she tried hard to hide. Our discussions grew heated. Jake argued for retreat until we could better understand what we'd found, while Riley urged us to press on, driven by the thrill of the unknown. I found myself caught between them, trying to balance caution with curiosity and silently praying that our differences wouldn't tear us apart when we needed each other most. Later that evening, after a long day of hiking and bickering, we decided to gather around a small makeshift campfire outside the RV. The forest was alive with shadows and the crackle of dead leaves underfoot. Just as the fire's warmth began to push back the encroaching cold, an unexpected visitor arrived, a local Ojibwe elder named Elijah. We had met him briefly at a nearby trading post earlier that day, but his presence at our camp was both surprising and disconcerting. With deep-set eyes that seemed to carry the weight of centuries, he spoke in a low, measured tone about the land's ancient curses and the wrath of the Wendigo. "Elijah," Jake began hesitantly, "we found these carvings, and there are tracks we can't explain. What does it all mean?" The elder's gaze swept over us slowly. "The land is sacred," he said, "and it remembers when the balance is broken. You have trespassed into realms where ancient hunger still lingers. The Wendigo is not a myth, but a warning, a spirit of famine and human greed. It comes for those who forget the old ways." His words sent shivers down my spine. I listened, captivated and terrified in equal measure, as Elijah recounted tales of past transgressions and the dire consequences that befell those who ignored nature's warnings. His presence felt both protective and ominous, and I realized that our journey had taken on a weight far heavier than mere adventure. The night deepened, and the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the aging RV. I awoke in the early hours to a soft, dissonant rustling outside, as if something was moving just beyond the reach of our campfire's light. I peered out into the darkness and, for a fleeting moment, caught a glimpse of a gaunt figure standing among the trees. It was too tall and too thin to be human, with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. My heart pounded as I whispered his name to myself. The Wendigo, the harbinger of doom that Elijah had warned us about. The next day, after a restless sleep filled with half-remembered dreams of endless forests and howling winds, our situation worsened. The RV's failing battery meant that our only source of light, the generator, was unreliable. With each passing hour, our isolation grew more pronounced. We found ourselves arguing over every little decision. Jake insisted on staying put until we could repair the generator, while Riley proposed we hike to a nearby ranger station for help. Sarah and I tried to mediate, but the group's cohesion was fraying like old rope. As dusk approached, an unsettling quiet settled over the camp. The laughter of children returned, louder this time, and unmistakably close. I stepped outside to investigate, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam caught movement, a pair of small, darting shapes disappearing behind a clump of birch trees. I followed, my breath held tight in my chest, until I reached a clearing where I discovered remnants of what looked like an old playground. Rusted swings and a broken merry-go-round lay in eerie silence, their decay accentuated by the encroaching night. It was as if the ghosts of lost innocence were playing out a cruel memory, a reminder of past sorrows that the forest refused to forget. That night, tensions reached a breaking point. Around the RV's dim interior light, voices were raised in frustrated debates about our next move. Jake's voice trembled with fear, Riley's with excitement, and Sarah's with quiet indignation. I listened, torn between them, when suddenly a violent storm erupted outside. Rain pounded the roof, and thunder rolled like the footsteps of an enraged giant. In the chaos, we heard a blood-curdling scream that shattered the bickering. A scream that seemed to come from deep within the forest, or perhaps from the very spirit of the land. In the aftermath of the storm, we discovered evidence that one of us had nearly vanished. Scattered belongings and a set of deep, claw-like marks on the ground hinted that the creature we now feared was not content to simply haunt us. It was actively stalking us. The realization struck us like a physical blow. The Wendigo was not a passive presence, it was a predator, and it was closing in. I suggested that we perform the Ojibwe rituals Elijah had mentioned, a desperate bid to appease the angry spirit. With trembling hands, we gathered natural offerings, sage, sweetgrass, and water from the nearby lake, and arranged them in a circle around the RV. As the wind howled and the temperature plummeted, we recited the ancient prayers that Elijah had taught us. For a long moment, it felt as if time itself had stopped, the forest holding its breath in anticipation. Then, in the darkness, a chill descended that was deeper and more penetrating than the cold wind could ever be. The symbols on the trees seemed to glow faintly, and I swear I saw the gaunt figure of the Wendigo circling our makeshift sanctuary, its eyes burning with a predatory hunger. In that instant, our fragile hope turned to terror. The creature moved with unnatural speed, shattering the protective circle and plunging us into chaos. Jake, always the planner, was the first to react. He grabbed an old metal pipe from the RV's storage while Riley fumbled for his camera, intent on documenting every horrifying moment. Sarah's rationality crumbled in the face of such malevolence. She began shouting for us to run, her voice overlapping with the ragged breathing that marked the approach of the creature. I felt paralyzed, caught between the urge to flee and the need to protect the friends who had become my family. The Wendigo's presence was overwhelming. Its ragged breath, the snapping of twigs under its weight, and the sickening realization that its eyes were fixed on us as if we were prey. For what felt like an eternity, we stood frozen, the only sounds the pounding of our hearts and the relentless, mocking laughter of those distant, ghostly children. In a desperate bid for survival, I managed to wrench myself free from my paralysis. "We need to run," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear and determination. Jake and Riley hesitated only a moment before following my lead, while Sarah trailed behind, her eyes wide with terror. We bolted into the darkness, leaving behind the shattered remnants of our campsite. The forest closed in around us, the towering trees twisting into grotesque shapes as the Wendigo's cries echoed behind us. We stumbled through the underbrush, guided only by the faint glow of our flashlights and the raw instinct to survive. Every snap of a branch and every rustle of leaves seemed amplified, as though the forest itself conspired with the creature. We lost track of time in the frantic sprint, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, our minds filled with the primal fear of being hunted. At one point, Jake tripped over a hidden root, and as he scrambled to his feet, I saw a flash of something, an elongated shadow that darted between the trees. It was then that I realized, with a sinking heart, that the Wendigo wasn't merely chasing us. It was toying with us, stalking us through the labyrinth of the forest with an almost predatory glee. The hours stretched on, and exhaustion began to claw at our senses. We reached a small clearing near a frozen stream, and in that brief respite we huddled together, our faces streaked with tears, rain, and dirt. Sarah, who had been the voice of reason, broke the silence. "We can't keep running like this. We need to come up with a plan, or we'll be at its mercy." Jake, ever the cautious one, suggested returning to the RV to regroup and fortify our defenses. But Riley, whose bravado had carried him this far, argued that staying in one place would only make us easier targets. We were trapped between a rock and a hard place. If we stayed, the Wendigo might converge upon us. If we left, we risked becoming hopelessly lost in a forest that now seemed imbued with malevolence. In that moment, I recalled Elijah's words and the ancient rituals we had attempted. "Maybe we need to try again," I whispered, more to myself than to the others. "We need to show the spirit that we respect the old ways, that we're not here to take, but to honor." It was a desperate hope, one born of a last-ditch need to reclaim some control over the nightmarish scenario unfolding around us. After a tense debate, we agreed to return to the RV. The journey back was no less harrowing. The forest was alive with unseen eyes and sinister whispers that seemed to seep into our very souls. When we finally reached the battered RV, we barricaded the doors and windows as best we could and huddled together in its cramped interior. Outside, the wind moaned like a lament, and the snapping of branches sounded eerily like the Wendigo's ragged breaths. In that suffocating space, time lost all meaning. We took turns keeping watch while the others tried to rest, though sleep was a luxury none of us could truly afford. I found myself replaying the Ojibwe prayers in my mind, feeling their weight and wondering if they could still offer any protection. The supernatural threat was no longer just a legend. It was real, violent, and hungry. Then, in the dead of night, a final confrontation shattered our fragile sanctuary. I awoke to the sound of shattering glass and the unmistakable scrape of something dragging across the RV's metal exterior. My heart hammered in my chest as I stumbled to the window, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. There, illuminated by intermittent flashes of lightning, I saw it. The gaunt, twisted form of the Wendigo, its eyes glinting with a feral light, as if it were savoring our terror. The creature circled the RV, its elongated limbs moving with a disturbing, unnatural grace. I could hear its ragged breathing, each exhale a promise of pain and death. In that moment, I understood that survival was not a matter of outsmarting an animal or evading the elements. It was a battle against a force of ancient, unyielding malice. Our frantic attempts to ward it off with improvised weapons and desperate prayers seemed futile as the creature battered our fragile defenses. Then, as if in a final act of defiance, the Wendigo lunged. The impact sent Jake sprawling, and in the ensuing chaos, I watched in horror as one of our own, Riley, was dragged from the safety of the RV into the waiting, shadowed forest. I screamed, the sound lost in the cacophony of the creature's unearthly howls and the relentless storm. In that split second, every argument, every moment of doubt, coalesced into a singular burning need for survival. I scrambled to grab a heavy iron rod from the storage compartment, my hands trembling uncontrollably. With a primal yell, I swung at the creature as it hovered near the open door. There was a sickening thud as metal met flesh, or something that resembled flesh, and the creature recoiled momentarily. That brief victory was bittersweet. I knew that we were in the clutches of a relentless, vengeful force, and that our ordeal was far from over. In the chaotic aftermath, as the creature retreated into the dark embrace of the forest, I clutched the rod and called out to Jake and Sarah, who were scrambling after Riley's fading cry. We knew then that our unity was our only chance. With trembling determination, we agreed to push back the tide of terror with both modern ingenuity and the ancient rituals Elijah had taught us. We gathered the salvaged offerings once more, and, with voices raw from fear, repeated the Ojibwe incantations under the fleeting light of a salvaged lantern. That night was a blur of desperation and defiance. The Wendigo, a spectral embodiment of our collective fears and transgressions, seemed to waver under the force of our recited prayers, its malevolent presence gradually receding into the inky black of the forest. Whether our words had truly warded it off, or merely delayed its inevitable return, I could not say. What I did know was that the forest had claimed its due in blood and terror. In the aftermath of that long, harrowing night, the survivors emerged battered and forever changed. Riley was never found, his disappearance a grim reminder of the creature's cruelty. Jake, Sarah, and I, though physically intact, carried the invisible scars of our encounter. The forest, with its ancient trees and whispered secrets, had revealed a side of nature that was not meant for human eyes, a raw, elemental force that punished hubris and greed. We eventually managed to repair the RV and find our way back to civilization, but the return was anything but triumphant. Our story, once a testament to the lure of wilderness adventure, had become a somber chronicle of survival against an ancient evil. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see the gaunt figure of the Wendigo, feel the biting cold of that fateful night, and hear the ghostly laughter of children echoing through the dark. I now spend my days trying to reconcile the rational parts of my mind with the surreal terror I experienced in the Superior National Forest. I document every detail of that autumn, not just as a memoir of survival, but as a warning. The wilderness is not a playground for the careless, and ancient forces still roam the land, waiting for the moment when we dare to disturb them. As I write this, I can still hear the distant echoes of that fateful night, a reminder that even in our modern world, the old spirits and ancient curses remain ever vigilant. The forest, the legends, and the blood-stained trails of that October will forever haunt my memories. And every time I catch a glimpse of a shadow in the corner of my eye or hear an inexplicable whisper in the wind, I am reminded that the line between myth and reality is thinner than we dare to imagine. This journey into the heart of darkness taught me that survival is not just about outrunning danger, but about confronting the depths of our own fears, accepting the mysteries of nature, and recognizing that some ancient evils are not meant to be tamed. In the end, the forest remains a silent, eternal judge, its secrets locked away in time, waiting for the next soul brave enough to venture into its shadowed depths. And so, I live with that haunting truth. In the wild expanse of northern Minnesota, where the trees whisper and the wind carries forgotten cries, the old world still holds sway. The Wendigo, a monstrous echo of human folly and nature's retribution, lurks in the darkness, a reminder that our lives are but fleeting moments in a landscape governed by forces far older and far more terrible than we can ever comprehend. My name is Ethan Miller. I'm 42, and this is the story of the night I sought solitude in Itasca State Park, only to find that isolation can force a reckoning with both ghosts of the past and those of a different nature. This happened last November, when the world outside seemed to have shrunk into a silent, gray emptiness, and the only company I had was my own regret and the whisper of the pines. I had spent years burying myself in work, trying to drown out the memory of the accident that claimed my wife's life. Every day since, guilt and sorrow had been my constant companions, a weight that made every breath feel heavy. When I finally decided to leave the city behind, I clung to the hope that the quiet wilderness might offer me some respite, some chance to confront the dark corners of my past. My aging RV, battered but still serviceable, became my moving sanctuary on this desperate journey toward redemption. I chose Itasca State Park for its remoteness and its legends. The dense pine forests and reflective lakes held an eerie beauty that promised both solace and challenge. I had read about the White Lady, a spectral figure said to appear to those burdened by grief and regret. I didn't know if I believed in ghost stories, but my heart was heavy with loss, and I welcomed any sign that I wasn't alone in my suffering. The drive up to the park was a blur of rain-soaked highways and moments of uneasy silence. The RV's heater sputtered intermittently, and the outdated electrical system left me fumbling with flickering lights. Every malfunction felt like a physical manifestation of my inner instability. Yet, I pressed on, determined to reach a secluded lakeside spot deep in the park. After setting up camp on the edge of a small, still lake, I took a long walk along a narrow trail bordered by towering pines. The forest, wrapped in a thick mist, muffled my footsteps and filled my ears with the gentle rustling of leaves. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not in a sinister way, but as if the forest itself were aware of my presence. The silence was profound, and every sound seemed magnified, echoing through the trees like soft, indistinct whispers. That evening, as dusk bled into night, I settled into the cramped living space of my RV. I brewed a weak cup of coffee and sat by the window watching the mist roll over the lake's surface. The RV's lights flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw shapes shifting in the reflection of the water. I chalked it up to my tired eyes and the unreliability of the old wiring. Still, an undercurrent of unease crept along the edges of my thoughts. Before retiring for the night, I ventured outside to stretch my legs and clear my mind. The temperature had dropped sharply, and the chill seemed to seep right into my bones. As I wandered along the shoreline, I heard something. A faint sound, like soft, indistinct voices carried on the wind. At first, I assumed it was merely the rustling of the leaves. But then, in the distance, I caught a glimpse of a figure, a woman in a flowing white dress standing at the water's edge. Her presence was fragile, almost translucent, and she seemed to be staring directly at me with eyes that shimmered with both sorrow and longing. My heart pounded as I froze in place. The legend of the White Lady flitted through my mind, and though I had dismissed it as myth in better times, the sight before me unsettled me deeply. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, she was gone, leaving only ripples on the lake and the echo of a gentle sigh. Unsure whether I had hallucinated the entire scene, or if grief had conjured a memory of my wife, I hurried back to the RV, the sound of my own footsteps the only comfort in that moment of eerie solitude. Inside the RV, the storm began to rage outside. The rain battered the thin metal walls, and the howling wind made the windows rattle. I huddled in a corner, the spectral vision of the White Lady mingling with memories of my lost love. Each flash of lightning illuminated the cramped space, revealing the scars of past neglect in the peeling upholstery and rusted fixtures. I could not help but see parallels between the dilapidated state of the RV and the broken fragments of my soul. Sleep came fitfully that night, disturbed by dreams that blurred the boundaries between memory and nightmare. I dreamt of my wife's gentle laughter and then of a shadowy figure with hollow eyes standing at the edge of a dark forest. The dreams left me with a lingering dread that I couldn't shake upon waking. In the early hours of the morning, I forced myself to rise, hoping that the daylight would banish the phantoms that haunted my sleep. The next day, I decided to take a walk deeper into the park, hoping that the physical exertion would clear my mind. The mist had lifted slightly, and the forest was bathed in a cold, pale light. As I ambled along an old trail, I noticed that the familiar sounds of the forest had a different timbre, a subtle, almost musical quality that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. The further I walked, the more I felt an inexplicable pull toward a small clearing near the lake. There, in the center of the clearing, lay a series of faint, circular patterns etched into the ground. I knelt and traced my fingers over the damp earth, wondering if they were natural formations or the remnants of something older, something deliberately left behind. The symbols resembled those I'd seen in books about local Native American lore, marks that were said to be offerings or warnings to the spirits of the land. A chill ran through me as I realized that perhaps my presence here was stirring up more than just my own memories. As I sat in the clearing, trying to make sense of the signs, I heard footsteps approaching. I tensed, half expecting to see another camper or park visitor. Instead, a soft, measured voice spoke from behind me. "You seem troubled, friend." I turned slowly to see an older man, dressed in plain, rugged clothes that spoke of many years spent in these woods. His eyes, kind, yet filled with an unspoken sorrow, examined me as though he had been waiting for my arrival. "I'm Ethan," I said, my voice sounding small in the vastness of the forest. "I came here to find some peace, and maybe to find a way to forgive myself." The man nodded slowly. "I'm Ray," he replied. "I've spent my life among these pines listening to their secrets. They say the White Lady appears to those who carry a heavy heart, and that sometimes the forest offers a chance for redemption." His words resonated with me, and for a moment I felt that perhaps this was not just another ghost story, but an opportunity, a warning, even, that the past must be faced before it can be laid to rest. We spoke for a long while, sitting on a fallen log as Ray recounted local legends and personal tales of loss and healing. He told me of many souls who had wandered these woods, each seeking to mend what was broken within them. Ray's gentle wisdom was a balm to my troubled mind, and I felt the weight of my guilt lighten, if only slightly, with the knowledge that I wasn't alone in my pain. That evening, as I returned to the RV with Ray's parting words echoing in my mind, the atmosphere around the campsite grew palpably different. The sky darkened prematurely, and an unusual hush fell over the trees. I tried to shake off the unease, attributing it to the storm that was gathering on the horizon, but deep inside I sensed that something was amiss. Back inside the RV, I attempted to repair the flickering light, a small task that suddenly became an exercise in frustration as the wires refused to cooperate. In my struggle, I heard the sound of soft, indistinct whispers outside, as if the wind were carrying voices from another time. My fingers trembled as I fumbled with the tools, and every creak of the old RV seemed to mock my desperation. Finally, as dusk bled into night, I managed to secure a dim, steady glow from a lantern. I sat by the window listening to the wind's mournful song when I saw her again, the White Lady. This time, she stood at the edge of the tree line, her figure outlined against the faint light. There was a profound sadness in her eyes, a silent plea that cut through the darkness like a shard of ice. I felt compelled to step outside, even though every instinct screamed to remain sheltered. I hesitated only a moment before donning my coat and venturing out into the cold night. The rain had begun to fall softly, each drop a tiny percussion against the silence of the forest. As I approached the spot where I had seen her, I felt a strange mix of dread and hope. Perhaps, I thought, she was here to guide me toward a resolution I so desperately needed. "Who are you?" I called out softly, my breath clouding in the chill air. The only response was the rustling of leaves. I moved slowly, my footsteps careful on the wet ground, until I reached the water's edge. The figure of the White Lady was now closer, almost within reach. I could see the delicate features of her face, etched with sorrow beyond mortal years. For a moment I was convinced I recognized her. The gentle smile reminded me of the one I once cherished. But then, as quickly as the thought came, it was replaced by the unnerving realization that she was not my wife, but something else entirely. A messenger of regret and the consequences of a life left unresolved. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen, grappling with the duality of grief and supernatural wonder. In that silent exchange, the White Lady's eyes seemed to plead for something unspoken, a forgiveness that I had denied myself for too long. The moment stretched on, timeless and fraught with emotion, until she slowly turned and began to fade into the darkness. I stood there long after she had vanished, the impact of the encounter sinking deep into my soul. The forest around me seemed to exhale, as if releasing years of pent-up sorrow. I felt a profound release, a subtle shift in the heavy burden I had carried for so long. Yet, I also knew that the journey toward healing was far from over. The spectral visitor had merely opened a door to a confrontation with my past, a confrontation I had been avoiding for years. Returning to the RV, I resolved to face what I had long denied. The next morning, with the first light of dawn breaking through the pines, I began to sort through my memories. I wrote in a small journal, the words flowing slowly at first, as I recounted the day's surreal events and the stirring of emotions that came with them. Each entry was a step toward forgiving myself, a way to accept the mistakes that had defined so much of my life. Over the following days, I worked on mending both the RV and my inner turmoil. The electrical glitches and mechanical failures became metaphors for the broken parts of me that I now sought to repair. I spent hours outdoors, allowing the rhythmic pulse of nature to soothe my frayed nerves. In quiet moments, I could almost hear Ray's steady voice reminding me that healing was a process, a slow, painful, yet ultimately liberating journey. I began to see that the legends of the forest, the White Lady, the whispering pines, weren't meant to terrify me, but to help me confront the ghosts of my own making. They were nature's way of telling me that some pains must be acknowledged before they can be laid to rest. And in that acknowledgement, I found a fragile hope, a possibility for redemption. One chilly evening, as I sat by a small fire outside the RV, I felt an overwhelming sense of calm mixed with anticipation. The wind was soft and carrying a new kind of melody, a gentle harmony that seemed to rise from the earth itself. I closed my eyes, letting the sound wash over me, and for the first time in years I felt a glimmer of peace. It was as if the forest had finally accepted me, scars and all, and was offering me a chance to begin anew. When I eventually packed up the RV and prepared to leave Itasca State Park, I did so with a deep, unspoken understanding that my journey wasn't over. It was only beginning. I left behind the dark, haunted woods with a heart slightly lighter and a spirit that, while still burdened by loss, had learned to carry hope alongside sorrow. The memories of the White Lady, the whispered legends, and the enduring presence of nature would forever be etched in my soul, a constant reminder that redemption is possible even in the depths of isolation. As I drove away on that crisp morning, the forest receded in my rearview mirror, yet its echoes stayed with me. Every mile took me further from the physical confines of Itasca State Park, but the lessons I learned there about forgiveness, acceptance, and the healing power of nature remained indelibly inscribed in my being. I realized that the ghosts I had encountered were not just remnants of an ancient past, but reflections of my own inner struggles, guiding me toward a future where I might finally let go of the past and embrace the possibility of new beginnings. Now, whenever I feel the weight of my memories pressing in, I close my eyes and remember that night among the pines, the gentle figure in white, and the soft voices of the forest that urged me to forgive myself. I understand that the path to healing is long and winding, but I also know that even in the midst of isolation, there is beauty to be found. A beauty that comes from confronting our deepest sorrows and emerging, however scarred, into the light of a new day. This journey, as harrowing as it was, taught me that redemption is not found by fleeing from our past, but by embracing it, with all its pain and beauty. The forest, with its timeless whispers and spectral guides, had shown me the way back to myself. And though I continued to travel life's winding roads in my old RV, I now do so with the knowledge that I carry both loss and hope in equal measure. A reminder that even the darkest nights can yield to the promise of dawn. My name is Ethan Malone, and I'm 34 years old. This is the story of the RV trip that turned into a nightmare in the remote reaches of Superior National Forest near Bear Creek in northern Minnesota. A journey meant to be an escape, but which ultimately became a battle for survival against forces beyond our understanding. I've always been drawn to adventure, to pushing the boundaries of the familiar, so when my friends Sarah, Mike, and Lila suggested a weekend getaway in the backwoods, I couldn't resist. We piled into our old RV, a clunky, outdated rig that I'd affectionately dubbed the Beast, and set out with high spirits and a promise of freedom. I knew it wasn't state-of-the-art. The navigation system had seen better days, and the engine had sputtered on more than one occasion. But that didn't dampen our excitement as we headed north, eager to leave the chaos of everyday life behind. We were heading to the area around Bear Creek, a little-known part of the forest steeped in local lore and whispered warnings of vengeful spirits. Sarah, always the empathetic soul and lover of folklore, had done her research. She'd told us about ancient Native American legends, stories of spirits and mysterious beings, sometimes resembling skinwalkers or even cannibalistic indigenous apparitions, said to wander the woods in search of trespassers. Mike, the practical one, scoffed at these tales, insisting that nature had its own explanations for every odd occurrence. Lila, creative and intuitive, was excited by the possibility of capturing something extraordinary on her sketchpad, though I sensed an underlying nervous energy in her eyes. Our first day was spent driving deeper into the forest, the dense canopy casting long, shifting shadows over the winding roads. The RV's unreliable navigation forced us to make several unplanned stops, and as dusk settled, we found ourselves in a small clearing near Bear Creek. The area was isolated, the silence nearly absolute, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. We set up camp, and as night fell, the crisp autumn air took on an uncanny chill. It started subtly at first. I remember sitting outside the RV with a thermos of coffee, watching the fog roll in from the creek. The temperature dropped so abruptly it felt like an unseen hand had flipped a switch. That's when I noticed the trees. Etched into several trunks were strange symbols, angular markings that looked almost ritualistic. I brushed it off as natural bark patterns until Sarah, with her keen eye for detail, recognized them as similar to the ancient warnings she'd read about in Native American legends. Later that evening, as we gathered around a small flickering campfire, the woods seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I could see shadows shifting in the peripheral vision, and every so often I'd catch a glimpse of a figure that vanished when I turned to look directly. Mike tried to reassure us with logical explanations. Animals, he said, are simply the interplay of light and dark. But even his voice wavered slightly as a low, almost imperceptible chanting echoed through the trees. It wasn't a sound any of us could place. It was haunting and filled with an ancient sorrow. I decided to take a short walk to clear my head, with Lila trailing close behind. As we ventured a few yards from the RV, the fog thickened. The world became a monochrome blur, and every step felt heavy, as if the very air was trying to hold us back. Suddenly, Lila grabbed my arm. "Ethan, look," she whispered, pointing toward a cluster of trees. I strained my eyes through the mist and saw what looked like a fleeting silhouette, a humanoid figure, its form blurred, as if it were made of smoke or shadow. It wasn't moving, just standing there watching us. My heart pounded. I recalled Sarah's warnings and my own overconfidence battling against a rising tide of fear. We hurried back to the RV, where Sarah was busy poring over her notes and local legends on her phone. "I found more details about these symbols," she said, her voice barely audible over the sudden gusts of wind that rattled the RV's thin walls. "They're said to be marks left by a vengeful spirit. A shaman who was wronged long ago, cursed to wander these woods, and sometimes accompanied by creatures that resemble skinwalkers." Mike rolled his eyes, though I could see the unease in his eyes too. "It's just folklore, Sarah. A story to scare kids and keep people away from dangerous areas," he insisted. But even he couldn't hide the tremor in his tone. That night, sleep was a distant memory. Every creak of the old RV, every rustle of leaves outside, sent my mind racing. I kept thinking back to that moment in the fog, the silhouette that seemed to beckon us deeper into the darkness. I drifted in and out of restless sleep, plagued by dreams of ghostly figures and ancient curses. The following morning, we attempted to shake off the previous night's terror with a plan to explore the trails near Bear Creek. We agreed that a short hike would help us clear our minds, and possibly even gather evidence of what we'd experienced. I led the way, partly determined to prove to myself and the others that there was nothing supernatural to be found. But as we made our way deeper into the forest, it quickly became apparent that nature itself was playing tricks on us. Our first sign of true unease came when we encountered an animal, a deer, or so we assumed, standing unnaturally still in the middle of the trail. It stared at us with eyes that seemed almost too knowing before it bolted silently into the woods. Moments later, a chill wind swept through the trees, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay and damp earth. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Sarah suggested we take a break by a small stream, where she pulled out a battered notebook filled with sketches and handwritten notes on the local legends. "Look at these markings," she said, pointing to a drawing of the same symbols we had seen on the trees near the RV. "They're ancient warnings. The legends say that if you disturb the spirit of the shaman, he summons his followers, entities that resemble skinwalkers. They're not just here to scare, they're dangerous." Mike's practical mind was struggling. "There's gotta be a rational explanation," he argued. "This area is remote, and our equipment isn't exactly top of the line. The old RV, the faulty compass, it's all just a series of unfortunate events." But deep down, even his skepticism was faltering. Lila, ever the sensitive soul, was visibly shaken. She began to sketch the surrounding forest, her hands trembling as she tried to capture the eerie interplay of shadow and light. "I feel like they're all around us," she murmured. "The trees, they're whispering secrets." Our group's tension grew with each passing moment. I could sense the divide, my own desire to push forward clashing with Sarah's insistence on caution, Mike's rationality warring with Lila's gut feelings. We decided to return to the RV, but the forest seemed determined to hold us in its grip. As dusk began to fall once again, we arrived back at our campsite to find the RV's engine sputtering ominously, a reminder that our means of escape might not be as reliable as we hoped. While Mike attempted to fix the engine, Sarah and I took a short walk around the perimeter, hoping to gather our thoughts. That's when we encountered the unthinkable. A figure emerged from behind a large oak, its features barely discernible in the gathering gloom. At first, it appeared to be a man in traditional Native American garb, but as it stepped closer, the details became more sinister. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly intensity, and its skin seemed to shimmer with a ghostly pallor. In a voice that was both human and guttural, it intoned words I couldn't understand, a curse, perhaps, or a warning. I froze. my heart pounding so hard I was sure it would burst from my chest. Sarah grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "Ethan, run!" she whispered, and for a moment everything else fell away. I turned to flee, but the figure was faster, blocking our path with an unyielding presence. In that terrifying moment, I felt an overwhelming mix of fear and guilt. I'd led my friends into this wilderness, chasing an adrenaline rush that I now regretted. But there was no time to dwell on that. Instinct took over, and I bolted in the opposite direction, urging Sarah to follow. Behind us, the figure's presence seemed to linger, a silent, menacing promise that we had not yet escaped its wrath. The night that followed was a blur of chaos. Inside the RV, Mike finally managed to coax the engine back to life, but our respite was short-lived. Outside, the supernatural presence intensified. The disembodied chanting resumed, louder and more insistent than before, echoing through the forest. The temperature plummeted even further, and the symbols on the trees seemed to glow faintly in the dark, as if charged by some ancient power. Tensions among us reached a boiling point. In the dim light of the RV's interior, Sarah and I argued over what should be done. "We need to respect what's here," she insisted. "This isn't just a case of bad luck or faulty equipment. These are forces that demand acknowledgement." I, on the other hand, was driven by the primal need to escape. "We can't stay here," I argued. "We're not equipped to handle whatever this is. We need to leave now." Mike, caught between our opposing views, tried to mediate. "Look, maybe we can figure out a way to appease whatever's out there," he suggested, though his voice betrayed his own uncertainty. "We could try something, maybe a ritual? Sarah, didn't you mention something about ancient Native American practices?" Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes haunted by the knowledge of what she'd uncovered. "Yes. There's a tradition of making offerings to spirits, of asking for forgiveness. It's not exactly a prayer for mercy, but perhaps it could buy us some time." Lila, who had been silent most of the night, finally spoke up in a trembling voice. "I can try to document everything, to create a record that might help us understand this curse. But I'm scared, Ethan. I've never felt anything like this before." The night dragged on, each minute filled with unpredictable horrors. Then, as if the forest itself had decided to make its most brutal statement, we encountered our first fatal blow. While Mike and I were outside checking the RV's engine again, a local guide, an old man we had met earlier on the trail who claimed to know the history of these woods, stumbled into our camp. His eyes were wild, and he babbled incoherently about a punishment that was coming. Before we could react, a spectral figure emerged from the darkness, its form indistinct yet terrifyingly real. In an instant, the guide was attacked, dragged away by a force we could neither see nor comprehend. His screams echoed into the night, then abruptly stopped, leaving us in a silence that was more terrifying than any sound. That death shattered any remaining illusions that we might have been safe. The supernatural forces around us grew more violent, more desperate. Shadows moved with sinister purpose, and the forest seemed to close in around our RV as if determined to trap us forever. I felt a deep, gnawing regret that I had pushed us into this situation. My overconfidence had blinded me to the warnings, and now we were paying the price. In a final desperate attempt to regain control, Sarah and Lila proposed that we try to perform a ritual, a blend of Native American tradition and our own hope for redemption. Mike reluctantly agreed to help secure a perimeter around the RV, using whatever makeshift defenses we could muster. With trembling hands, Sarah laid out a circle of stones and placed the ancient artifact she had discovered near the RV, a weathered token of a long-forgotten past. She recited incantations in a low, measured tone, her voice melding with the howling wind. Lila, sketchbook in hand, drew symbols in the dirt, her artistic strokes seemingly imbued with a desperate energy. I stood back, watching the ritual unfold as the forest around us responded with a deep, resonant hum. For a few agonizing minutes, it seemed as though time had stopped. The chanting ceased, the wind died down, and an eerie silence fell over the clearing. In that moment, I felt a flicker of hope, a possibility that our acknowledgement of the ancient power might grant us a reprieve. But the reprieve was short-lived. The silence was shattered by a blood-curdling scream that rent the night. The spectral figure reappeared, this time more defined, a terrifying visage of the shaman whose spirit had been wronged, his eyes burning with an ancient fury. His presence was overwhelming, and in his hand I thought I saw a jagged blade of light. The spirit advanced, its steps heavy and deliberate, and the ground itself seemed to tremble under its weight. Panic surged through us. Mike scrambled to start the RV and get it moving, while Sarah and Lila clutched each other in terror. I shouted for everyone to get in, my heart racing as I fumbled with the door. The spirit's presence was all around us now, a relentless force that seemed to push against our very souls. I could feel its malice, its intent to punish us for our intrusion, for our disrespect of the ancient ways. In those frantic moments, I realized that our survival depended not on our equipment, our logic, or even our collective will, but on our willingness to accept the supernatural reality before us. With a deep breath, I turned back to the spirit and, summoning every ounce of courage I had left, shouted, "We're sorry. We mean no harm. Please let us go." For a heartbeat, the forest held its breath. The spirit's eyes locked onto mine, and in that charged silence, I saw something that resembled sorrow mingled with anger. Then, as if in answer, it let out a guttural sound, a sound that was neither a word nor a prayer, and stepped aside. The oppressive force receded just enough for Mike to get the engine roaring once more. We didn't wait to see if the reprieve would last. With our hearts in our throats, we piled into the RV and drove off into the night. The forest seemed to chase us, every twisting road and shadow a reminder of the night's horrors. I couldn't shake the feeling that the spirit was still following, that our desperate plea had only delayed the inevitable. By the time we reached the main road, the first hints of dawn were breaking through the darkness. Exhausted and broken, we pulled over at a roadside diner, a safe haven of sorts, hoping to catch our breath and make sense of the night's events. The diner's neon sign flickered weakly as we stepped inside, our faces etched with the kind of terror that no words could describe. Over cups of lukewarm coffee, we recounted our experiences. Sarah was solemn, her eyes distant as she reviewed her notes and sketches, determined to understand the ancient curse that had nearly claimed our lives. Mike's skepticism was gone, replaced by a haunted resignation that told of nights filled with regret and fear. Lila was silent most of the time, her creative spirit forever altered by what she had witnessed. And I was left grappling with the realization that my thirst for adventure had led us into a labyrinth of ancient grudges and supernatural vengeance. That morning, as we made arrangements to return home and report the incident to local authorities, I couldn't help but feel that something fundamental had changed in me. The isolation of Bear Creek and the relentless assault of supernatural forces had stripped away any pretense of control. We had encountered an ancient power, one that demanded respect and was quick to punish those who dared disturb its slumber. In the weeks that followed, I spent many sleepless nights replaying every moment of that harrowing weekend. I pored over Native American legends and historical accounts of the region, trying to piece together the truth behind the spirit's wrath. I learned that the shaman whose visage had haunted us was said to have been betrayed and murdered by those who coveted his power, a story that had been passed down through generations as a cautionary tale. His vengeful spirit, they said, had the power to summon beings from the shadows, to blur the line between life and death. I reached out to Sarah, Mike, and Lila in the ensuing months, and we met occasionally to share our ongoing research and lingering fears. None of us could ever forget that night in the Superior National Forest, where the veil between our world and something far older and more dangerous had been lifted. We had survived, but the cost was more than just a friend lost and the scars on our bodies. It was the knowledge that some mysteries are better left undisturbed. Even now, when I find myself driving on quiet roads or walking in the early hours of the morning, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seem to move with a purpose, and every rustle of leaves reminds me of that spectral figure and the ancient curse that nearly ended our lives. My name is Ethan Malone, and I carry the weight of that night with me every day. A constant reminder that sometimes, in the heart of the wilderness, the past is never truly gone, and the darkness never fully dissipates. In the end, our escape from Bear Creek was only temporary. The memories linger like a persistent fog, a blend of regret and awe at the power of forces that predate our modern world. And though I try to forget, I know that on dark, lonely nights, the spirits of Superior National Forest still whisper their warnings, and sometimes, if you listen too closely, they call your name. My name is Jamie Carter, and I'm 42 years old. This happened last autumn when I decided to take my battered RV out into the wild heart of Voyageurs National Park in northern Minnesota, hoping to escape the relentless pressures of my everyday life and confront the demons of my past. I was fresh off a painful divorce, burdened with unresolved grief and a sense of guilt that had haunted me since childhood. I needed solitude, and maybe, somehow, answers. I had spent weeks planning this trip, poring over maps and reading every scrap of local lore I could find about the park and its surroundings. The dense, towering pines and endless stretches of isolation promised a kind of peace that city life had long since denied me. I didn't expect to find ghosts, but I couldn't have predicted that my own repressed memories would start manifesting in the most literal way possible. The RV, a clunky relic that had seen better days, was my only companion as I drove north. Its engine coughed and sputtered along the gravel roads, a constant reminder of its age and my own vulnerability. I wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea of being alone in the wilderness, but I had convinced myself that facing nature and my own inner turmoil alone was the best path to healing. I arrived at a secluded clearing near a narrow, winding road that cut through the heart of Voyageurs. The setting was surreal, a canopy of pines overhead, leaves crunching beneath my feet as I parked the RV, and a persistent, damp chill in the air that seemed to seep into my bones. I set up camp outside the RV, lighting a small fire for warmth, and prepared for what I hoped would be a few days of introspection. That first night, as darkness enveloped the forest and a relentless rain began to fall, I felt an unsettling energy in the silence. I sat huddled by the fire, lost in thought and the quiet hum of nature, when I suddenly heard a burst of static from the old radio mounted on the dashboard. I'd barely been paying attention until the static began to resolve into something distinctly familiar. "Jamie," a distorted voice whispered through the speakers, the cadence and intonation sending shivers down my spine. It was my mother's voice, or at least a memory of it. I had not heard her in decades, not since she had vanished from my life under mysterious circumstances when I was a child. The sound was soft, almost like a lullaby, but laced with a sorrow and accusation that I couldn't quite decipher. I reached out, my trembling hand hovering over the radio, but as quickly as the voice had emerged, it was replaced by ordinary static. I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than a glitch, an interference in an old machine. But that wasn't the only strange occurrence. As the night deepened, I began to notice odd reflections in every darkened window of the RV. For a moment, I swore I saw figures moving behind me, shadowy, indistinct silhouettes that vanished as soon as I turned around. I told myself it was just the play of light and rain, but deep down, a gnawing sense of dread took hold. The following morning, the sky was overcast and heavy with the promise of more rain. I decided to leave the RV for a while and explore the area on foot. I needed to clear my head and perhaps find some tangible evidence that what I had experienced was real. I followed a narrow trail that wound its way through the pines, each step taking me further into a landscape that felt as if it were alive with secrets. Not long into my hike, I came upon a small clearing where the ground was littered with stones arranged in a peculiar pattern. They formed a rough circle, and in the center lay a series of symbols carved into a flat, weathered stone. I recognized the markings from the local legends I'd read about, ancient warnings left by Native American shamans to appease restless spirits. My heart pounded as I knelt to examine the stone, the chill in the air now taking on a more sinister quality. Was this some kind of memorial, or a ritual site forgotten by time? I wasn't sure, but I felt an inexplicable pull, as if the very earth beneath me was urging me to remember something I had long tried to bury. As I continued along the trail, the forest began to whisper secrets in ways that defied explanation. Every now and then I would hear a soft knock on the bark of a tree, a gentle, rhythmic tapping that sounded almost like someone knocking on a door. I pressed my ear against the rough surface, half expecting a voice to speak to me, but there was only silence and the rustle of leaves. The atmosphere was heavy, laden with an emotion I couldn't name. It felt like the forest was mourning, as if it too was burdened by lost memories and unspoken regrets. Returning to the RV, I found it shrouded in an eerie mist that hadn't been there before. The rain had subsided, but the world outside looked transformed, a monochrome dreamscape where every shadow seemed to move with a hidden purpose. I sat inside, trying to piece together my fragmented thoughts, when I noticed an old family photograph that had somehow been placed on the dashboard. I didn't recall putting it there. The photo was faded and worn, showing a smiling woman whose eyes bore a haunting resemblance to the spectral voice I'd heard on the radio. My mother. That night, sleep eluded me. I spent hours tossing and turning, my mind haunted by memories I had long suppressed. In the pitch darkness, I saw fleeting images of my childhood, of arguments, of quiet tears, and of a deep, unspoken pain. I could almost hear my mother's gentle admonishments mingling with the wind outside. In one particularly vivid dream, I found myself standing before an ancient mirror inside a dilapidated cabin. The mirror was dark and reflective, as if it held within it the echoes of every soul that had ever looked into it. In the reflection, I saw not just my own face but that of my mother, her expression one of sorrow and longing, urging me to confront the truths I had hidden away. The next morning, driven by a desperate need for answers, I decided to seek help in a nearby town. I drove along a narrow road to a small settlement that seemed almost frozen in time, its rustic buildings and sparse population lending an air of mystery. There, I met Mrs. Lawson, a wizened old woman with eyes that seemed to pierce through to my very soul. She listened to my story in silence, nodding slowly as if every word was a confirmation of what she already knew. "You're carrying a heavy burden, Jamie," she said softly, her voice a blend of empathy and caution. "The spirits of these woods respond to pain and guilt. They are not here to harm you in the way a malevolent force would, but to force you to confront what you've long denied. Your mother's voice, those symbols, they're all part of a cycle that can only be broken if you face your past. Her words resonated with a truth I had tried to avoid for years. I asked her about the legends, about the mirror and the ritual of reconciliation. Mrs. Lawson's eyes darkened as she recounted tales of ancient rites and the restless spirits of those who had suffered injustice. "There is a way," she murmured, "to lay your demons to rest, but it will require you to return to where it all began, to a place that holds the memories of your childhood." That evening, armed with Mrs. Lawson's cryptic advice and a sense of grim determination, I returned to the area where I had first seen the carved stone. The rain had returned, a steady, relentless downpour that blurred the lines between reality and dream. I set up camp once more, this time with a purpose that transcended mere survival. I gathered what little family mementos I had managed to salvage: a tattered scarf, an old letter, a faded photograph, and placed them carefully inside the RV. They were tokens of a past I had long tried to forget, yet they might hold the key to my healing. As the dusk settled over the forest, I made my way to a dilapidated cabin I had noticed during my earlier hike. Its wooden frame creaked ominously in the wind, and the once vibrant paint was now chipped and faded. Inside, dust motes danced in the slivers of weak daylight that managed to filter through broken windows. In the center of the main room, I found an antique mirror, its surface dark and almost liquid in appearance. I approached it with trepidation, my heart pounding in anticipation of what I might see. I placed my hand on the mirror's frame, feeling a cold, electric tingle run through my skin. The reflection that stared back at me was not my own, not entirely. Alongside my weary face, I saw the faint, translucent image of a woman whose eyes were brimming with sorrow and regret. It was as if the mirror was drawing out the memories of my mother, forcing them to manifest before me. I choked back a sob as the scene shifted, and in the reflection I saw flashes of my childhood, the painful moments, the arguments, the times I had turned away from her pleading eyes. The room seemed to close in around me as the past and present merged into a single, overwhelming moment. I heard my mother's voice again, soft yet insistent, urging me to remember, to forgive, and to let go of the guilt that had chained me for so long. "Jamie, remember me," the voice whispered, mingling with the patter of the rain outside. In that moment, I understood that the supernatural occurrences were not merely random hauntings. They were manifestations of my own inner turmoil, externalized by the ancient energies that lingered in these woods. Determined to break the cycle, I decided to perform a ritual of reconciliation right there in the cabin. Following the vague instructions that Mrs. Lawson had given me, I arranged the family mementos in a circle around the mirror. I lit a single candle, its flame quivering in the damp air, and began to recite a prayer. A blend of my own words and the fragments of old incantations I'd read about. My voice trembled at first, but as I continued, a strange calm began to wash over me. I spoke of forgiveness, of pain endured and lessons learned, and of the hope for redemption. For several agonizing minutes, I remained there, lost in the act of confronting every regret and every memory that had haunted me. The mirror's surface shimmered, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw my mother's face smiling gently, as if in silent approval. Then, the light of the candle flickered violently, and a gust of wind slammed the cabin door shut. In that instant, the oppressive weight that had pressed on my soul lifted ever so slightly, and I felt a profound sense of release. But the forest was not done with me yet. As I stepped outside, the rain had ceased, leaving the air eerily still and the night unusually dark. I sensed a presence lurking just beyond the edge of the light, an indistinct shape in the distance that seemed to watch my every move. It wasn't menacing, not in the way that a wild animal might be, but it was as if the forest itself had gathered its strength to remind me of the price of forgetting one's past. I drove back to the RV slowly, my mind a swirling mix of relief and lingering unease. The drive back was quiet, the roads empty, and the pines looming like silent sentinels on either side. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror for long stretches, afraid of what I might see. Every so often, I caught a glimpse of a shadow at the edge of my vision, a silent reminder that, while I might have started to let go of the past, it would always be a part of me. Over the next few days, I remained in that secluded spot, repairing minor damages to the RV and slowly regaining a sense of normalcy. The supernatural phenomena gradually subsided, replaced by the quiet, reflective solitude of nature. I spent long hours walking the trails, revisiting the clearing with the stone circle, and even venturing back to the abandoned cabin to sit silently before the broken mirror. Each visit deepened my understanding that the spirits I had encountered were not purely malevolent forces. They were echoes of my own soul, fragments of a life filled with both sorrow and love, urging me to remember and to forgive. I kept a journal throughout my time in Voyageurs, chronicling every strange sound, every whispered word, and every flicker of memory that the forest evoked. I found that by writing down my experiences, I could begin to untangle the web of guilt and regret that had long held me captive. In those pages, I rediscovered the story of my childhood, a story that had been obscured by pain and fear, but which now shone with a bittersweet clarity. I remembered my mother's laughter, the warmth of her embrace, and even the small moments of tenderness that I had long forgotten. By the time I finally packed up the RV and prepared to leave the remote sanctuary of Voyageurs National Park, I felt an undeniable change within me. The ghosts that had once tormented me had, in their own mysterious way, led me to a long overdue confrontation with my past. I knew that I would carry the memories of those nights forever, but they no longer held the power to paralyze me. Instead, they had become a part of my story, a reminder that even in the darkest, most isolated places, there is the potential for healing. Driving back toward civilization, the landscape gradually shifted from dense, brooding pines to open roads and small towns bathed in the soft glow of early morning light. I often found myself pausing at rest stops, watching the horizon, and wondering if the whispers of the forest would ever truly fade away. I knew that while I had left the physical space behind, the echoes in the pines would remain a permanent part of me, a symbol of my journey from despair to acceptance. My name is Jamie Carter, and I am forever changed by that solitary trip into the heart of Voyageurs. What began as an escape from the pain of a fractured past turned into a profound journey of self-discovery. In the quiet solitude of those northern woods, I learned that confronting one's inner demons is perhaps the most daunting challenge of all. And though the apparitions and whispers of that autumn night still echo in my mind, they serve as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. A spirit capable of transforming sorrow into strength and guilt into grace. Even now, on quiet evenings when the wind carries a hint of distant voices and the pines sway under the starry sky, I can almost hear my mother's soft, reassuring whisper mingling with the rustle of leaves. It reminds me that no matter how far I travel, the journey inward is never truly complete. The forest taught me that forgiveness is not a destination, but a continual process, a delicate balance between remembering and letting go. And in that balance I found the peace I had been searching for all along. My name is Jonas Miller. I'm 38 years old, and this is the story of a camping trip that turned into a nightmare deep in Superior National Forest, Minnesota. What began as a hopeful escape into nature's solitude and mystery became a descent into terror, a confrontation with forces I never imagined could be real. I've always been drawn to the legends of the North, the old tales whispered by local elders about the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit born of greed and cannibalism that roams these ancient woods. When my friends, Emily Rivera and Mark Thompson, suggested a weekend RV getaway to a remote section of the forest, I felt both excitement and an inexplicable apprehension. Emily, a free-spirited photographer with an insatiable curiosity about the eerie and unknown, and Mark, a witty, skeptical engineer whose scientific mind often clashed with the supernatural, rounded out our unlikely trio. We loaded up our aging RV, a creaky, unreliable beast with flickering headlights and an engine that coughed more than it roared, with camping gear, provisions, and a battered old map of Superior National Forest. I couldn't shake the feeling that our destination, a secluded glade near a cluster of towering pines, was fated to reveal secrets beyond our control. Our route was uncharted, the roads rugged and full of unexpected detours. Mark joked about our vintage adventure machine, but even his humor couldn't disguise the tension simmering beneath the surface. The journey started with light-hearted banter as we drove through winding roads and past shimmering lakes, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. Emily chattered excitedly about capturing the perfect shot of the forest's hidden corners, while Mark grumbled about our outdated equipment and the inefficiencies of our RV. I tried to keep the mood steady, playing the role of mediator as well as the planner, though deep inside I was haunted by memories of childhood tales of the Wendigo and other spirits said to roam these woods. We finally arrived at our chosen spot, a clearing hemmed in by ancient pines and draped in a persistent mist that refused to lift. The forest was unnervingly quiet, as if nature itself was holding its breath. I set down my duffel bag and began unloading equipment, while Emily wandered off a few feet to scout the area with her camera. Mark, true to form, immediately started checking the RV's engine, which sputtered ominously before settling into a steady hum. The initial sense of isolation soon turned into something more disconcerting. That first night, as we settled around a small, crackling fire beside the RV, the forest seemed to come alive with odd sounds. The wind rustled through the pines in a pattern that almost resembled whispered words, and every so often I caught sight of a shadow flitting between the trees. Emily, ever the observer, snapped photos, convinced that the interplay of light and shadow held hidden stories. Mark merely shook his head, dismissing our worries as tricks of the imagination born of too many ghost stories. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning, when a chill crept into the clearing and the temperature plummeted without explanation, that I noticed something truly unsettling. I awoke to the sound of faint, almost childlike giggles echoing through the darkness. A sound so out of place in the vast, indifferent forest that it sent shivers down my spine. I stared out the RV's window into the inky blackness, half expecting to see a playful apparition, but there was nothing. Only the relentless silence and the soft rustling of leaves met my gaze. By sunrise, the unease had grown into palpable tension. We discovered strange tracks around our campsite. Large, oddly shaped footprints and claw-like marks gouged into the bark of the towering pines. I remembered the old journal I'd picked up at a dilapidated ranger station weeks ago, a journal filled with entries about a creature that stalked the woods with an insatiable hunger. The descriptions matched what we were beginning to see around us, and a cold realization dawned upon me. The legends were more than just stories. Despite our growing fears, we pressed on with our planned excursions. Emily's enthusiasm pushed us to document every eerie occurrence, and even Mark, despite his skepticism, couldn't ignore the mounting evidence that something was amiss. We hiked along narrow, winding trails that led deeper into the forest, each step taking us further from the comfort of civilization and into a realm where reality and myth blurred together. One afternoon, as we ventured along a particularly isolated path, the light dimmed inexplicably, as if a thick curtain of fog had descended even though the sky remained clear. Emily's camera flashed repeatedly as she tried to capture what she described as phantom figures, moving silently among the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Mark kept muttering about natural optical illusions and the misinterpretation of shadows, but his tone was edged with uncertainty. That evening, back at our RV, things took a dramatic turn. While I was tinkering with the malfunctioning headlights, Emily burst in, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. "I saw it," she whispered, nearly inaudible over the sound of the howling wind outside. A figure, no, something else, lurking at the edge of the clearing. It looked like a man, but his eyes were empty and his skin, it was like he was melting into the darkness. Mark scoffed initially, but the tremor in Emily's voice and the genuine fear in her eyes made it hard to dismiss. The following night, we experienced an event that shattered any remaining semblance of normalcy. As I lay in the RV, trying to catch a few hours of sleep, I was awoken by a loud, scraping sound against the side of our vehicle. I peered through the small window and saw dark, elongated shapes moving with purpose along the base of the RV. The clattering noise was relentless, punctuated by the distant sound of heavy breathing. I called out to Emily and Mark, and together we crept outside under the cover of darkness. In the weak light of our flashlights, the forest revealed a horror that defied explanation. The marks on the trees were deeper now, as if something had been clawing at them with deliberate intent. And then, there was the scent, a putrid, decaying odor that hung heavy in the air. It was not the smell of death as we knew it, but something far worse, something that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the forest. Our anxiety reached its peak when, at dawn, we stumbled upon an old, tattered journal wedged into the crevice of a large boulder near a forgotten trail. The pages, yellowed with age, detailed encounters with a creature the locals called the Wendigo. The journal spoke of a malevolent entity that preyed on those who ventured too far into its territory, an ancient curse that drove its victims to unspeakable acts. The words leaped off the page, mingling with the cold dread that had been building in our chests. With each passing night, the supernatural events grew more violent. The RV, already struggling with mechanical issues, became a target for what appeared to be an unseen assailant. One night, the vehicle shuddered violently as if struck by an invisible force. I scrambled to the door, heart pounding, only to see a dark silhouette vanish into the woods. Emily's photos from that night captured nothing but blurred shapes and eerie, unidentifiable forms. Mark, who had been our unwavering skeptic, began to admit that perhaps our dire situation was not merely a case of overactive imaginations. As days bled into nights, group tensions escalated. Emily's insistence on documenting every eerie detail clashed with Mark's growing discontent over the continuous false alarms and equipment failures. I found myself caught in the middle, trying to balance caution with the need to understand what was happening around us. Each one of us wrestled with our own inner demons. Mark with his need to rationalize the irrational, Emily with her unyielding curiosity, and I with the heavy burden of responsibility for our safety. The turning point came on a night when the forest seemed to come alive with a malevolent energy. I remember lying awake in the RV, listening to the sinister chorus of the wind and the distant, almost rhythmic sound of footsteps pounding on the forest floor. Then came the unmistakable sound of something, or someone scraping against the side of the vehicle. I grabbed a flashlight and, despite the terror clawing at my mind, stepped outside to investigate. What I saw will haunt me forever. At the edge of our clearing, half hidden by the dense trees, stood a figure that defied explanation. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs contorted in unnatural angles. The creature's eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its skin appeared to ripple and distort as if it were not entirely solid. I felt a surge of primal fear, an instinctual warning that this was no mere man. The legends of the Wendigo flooded back to me, the stories of a creature driven by an insatiable hunger, a being that had once been human but had succumbed to an ancient, malevolent curse. I retreated hastily back to the RV, my heart pounding in my ears. Inside, Emily and Mark were already awake, their faces etched with dread. We huddled together as the night wore on, each sound and every rustle of the leaves amplifying our terror. We decided that we had to confront the truth of what was haunting us. Despite the danger, we resolved to investigate the surrounding woods and gather evidence of the supernatural forces at work. Emily, fueled by a mixture of fear and determination, led the way with her camera slung over her shoulder, while Mark grudgingly followed, his scientific mind searching for a rational explanation. The deeper we ventured into the forest, the more intense the manifestations became. We stumbled upon a clearing where the ground was churned up, as if by massive, clawed feet. The old journal's warnings echoed in our minds, and I could sense that we were trespassing into a domain that defied human comprehension. The oppressive atmosphere was punctuated by sudden, violent gusts of wind that knocked us off balance, and every shadow seemed to hide a lurking menace. Then came the fateful moment. While Mark and I were examining a set of fresh, deep tracks near a cluster of ancient pines, a sudden movement in the corner of my eye made me spin around. There, emerging from the gloom, was the unmistakable form of the creature we had been dreading. A hulking, emaciated figure with eyes that burned with an unholy light. In that instant, every rational thought dissolved into raw terror. The creature lunged forward with a speed that defied its grotesque, twisted appearance. In the ensuing chaos, panic took hold. Mark, ever the skeptic until now, shouted for us to run. Emily's camera fell from her grasp as she screamed, and I bolted back toward the RV, my heart pounding like a war drum in my chest. The creature's pursuit was relentless. I could hear its ragged breathing and the snapping of brittle underbrush as it closed the distance between us. In a desperate bid to escape, I fumbled with the keys to start the engine, praying that the old RV would finally do its job. For what felt like an eternity, I raced through the forest, the RV's headlights cutting swaths of light through the oppressive darkness. Behind me, I could see the creature's silhouette darting between the trees, its movements erratic, yet driven by a single, savage purpose. In that moment of terror and desperation, I realized that our ordeal was not just a brush with the supernatural. It was a battle for survival against an entity that embodied the darkest nightmares of these ancient woods. The chase ended in a horrifying confrontation at a narrow, overgrown trail. I glanced in the rearview mirror and caught sight of Mark, who had lagged behind. In the chaos, the creature had reached him. I watched in horror as it closed in on him with a speed and brutality that left no time for rescue. Mark's cries of disbelief and terror echoed in my ears as the creature attacked. I dared not look away, paralyzed by the realization that my friend, the one who had been our voice of skepticism, was now the victim of the Wendigo's unrelenting violence. Emily, torn between freezing in shock and a desperate need to document the horror, tried to record the attack with trembling hands. Her scream, a mix of sorrow and terror, was the last sound I remember before I lost consciousness, the forest's darkness swallowing me whole. I awoke hours later, battered and alone, in the relative safety of the RV. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. The absence of Mark's presence, the stillness where chaos had reigned. Emily sat in the corner, her eyes vacant, the camera discarded on the floor, as if it were an object devoid of its previous purpose. I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. In the aftermath, the forest remained unchanged, its ancient pines standing silent witness to our suffering, the mist concealing secrets that would never be fully revealed. The creature's violent act had shattered the fragile barrier between myth and reality, leaving us to grapple with the profound isolation and terror that lingered in every rustle of leaves and every whisper of wind. I spent the following days attempting to piece together what had happened, reviewing Emily's photos and trying to make sense of the inexplicable phenomena. The images captured fleeting glimpses of the creature, ambiguous and blurred, yet undeniable in their indication that our encounter was not a figment of collective imagination. Local authorities dismissed our accounts as stress-induced hallucinations, attributing the events to the malfunctioning equipment and the isolation of the wilderness. But deep down, I knew that the forest had shown us something real, a dark, ancient force that could not be tamed or reasoned with. The guilt of survival and the loss of Mark weighed heavily on me. Every night, as I sat by the dim light of the RV's interior, I could almost hear his voice echoing through the pines, a ghostly reminder of the cost of our intrusion into a realm best left undisturbed. Emily, too, was changed. Her once vibrant spirit was now shrouded in a quiet, haunted sadness, as if the forest had imprinted its own sorrow upon her soul. Our shared trauma forged an unspoken bond between us. A silent acknowledgement that some legends are born of truths too dark for words. In the weeks that followed, I found myself drawn back to the woods in a futile attempt to understand the forces that had nearly consumed us. The Wendigo, with its insatiable hunger and violent nature, had left an indelible mark on my psyche. I began to record my experiences in meticulous detail, each word a desperate attempt to capture the horror that had taken root in the heart of Superior National Forest. I visited local libraries and spoke with indigenous elders, seeking answers to questions that haunted my every thought. What had we truly encountered that night? Was it simply a manifestation of ancient folklore, or had we disturbed a malevolent force that had slumbered undisturbed for centuries? The more I learned, the more I understood that the supernatural is not always a distant relic of myth, but a living, breathing presence that can invade even the most mundane of lives. Our encounter was a brutal reminder that nature's beauty is inextricably linked with its capacity for violence, and that the isolation we sometimes seek can expose us to realities beyond our control. I still drive that old RV on long, solitary trips through the backroads of Minnesota, though I no longer seek the thrill of adventure with the same reckless abandon. Instead, I drive with a deep, respectful caution, knowing that the forest holds memories of our past and the echoes of things best left alone. Emily's photographs, though a painful reminder of our lost friend and the horrors we faced, have become artifacts of a time when we came too close to the edge of human understanding. Now, as I pen these words, I can still hear the faint, mournful echoes of that night. The scraping against metal, the unearthly giggles, and the final, desperate cry of a friend lost to the darkness. Superior National Forest remains a place of beauty and terror, a realm where legends and reality intertwine in a dance as old as time itself. And I, Jonas Miller, 38 years old and forever changed, carry those memories with me. A constant reminder that sometimes in the quietest corners of the world, ancient evil still stirs, waiting for the unwary to cross its path. This is my story, a tale of survival, loss, and the haunting power of nature. A story that I hope serves as a caution to those who seek solace in isolation, for the woods have their own secrets, and not all of them are meant to be uncovered. My name is Rebecca Lawson. I'm 42 years old, and this all happened in Chippewa National Forest, Minnesota, a place I had hoped would grant me the solitude and inspiration to finally heal my broken past. I bought the RV with the intention of escaping the clamor of city life and the painful memories that haunted me. Instead, I found myself face to face with the ghosts of both history and my own guilt. I set off on a chilly September morning with nothing more than a few battered suitcases, a well-worn journal, and my old RV that had seen better days. It wasn't glamorous by any stretch. The RV's interior lights flickered, and its heater was unpredictable at best. But I welcomed these imperfections as reminders of my own fragile state, a state that, I hoped, might mend amidst the whispering pines of the Chippewa wilderness. Driving along long, winding roads that meandered through dense woodlands, I couldn't help but feel as if I were leaving behind more than just the city. Each mile seemed to strip away layers of urban chaos, replacing them with the quiet murmur of wind and the distant call of wildlife. I recalled childhood evenings spent listening to my grandmother's stories of local legends, tales of a vengeful spirit, the ghost of a Native American woman whose sorrow and rage were said to roam these very woods. I'd always dismissed those stories as myth, yet now they lingered in my mind like an uninvited whisper. After a long day of driving, I finally reached a secluded clearing near an old, abandoned cabin. The RV's engine groaned to a stop as I parked beneath towering pines, shrouded in a thin veil of mist. As I stepped out, the air was crisp and carried a faint scent of damp earth and pine needles. There was an almost tangible stillness, a silence that seemed too deep to be natural. I set up camp, taking comfort in the familiarity of my routine, even as an inexplicable sense of being watched prickled at the back of my neck. That first night, as darkness enveloped the forest, I sat by a small campfire outside the RV, letting the flames push back the encroaching shadows. The crackling of the fire was soothing at first, but then I began to hear soft, indistinct whispers that seemed to drift on the wind. At first, I assumed it was just the rustling of leaves, but the words were too deliberate, too mournful. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to convince myself it was only my imagination. Yet, as I scribbled notes in my journal by the weak light of a lantern, I caught sight of something moving in the corner of my eye, a fleeting shadow that vanished as soon as I turned to look. The following morning, I awoke early to a gray, overcast sky. I made myself a cup of coffee and stepped outside, determined to explore my surroundings. I wandered along a narrow trail that wound through the trees. The forest was alive with sound, the rustle of critters in the underbrush, the creaking of branches in the breeze. And yet, there was an undercurrent of unease. When I reached a small clearing near the old cabin, I noticed something odd. Faint impressions on the ground that resembled footprints, larger and deeper than any animal I could recognize. They were accompanied by marks gouged into the bark of nearby trees, as if some unseen force had clawed at them. My pulse quickened as I realized these signs mirrored the descriptions in the journal I'd found at a local library months ago. Accounts of a spirit that haunted these woods, seeking justice for a past wrong. Back at the RV, I tried to focus on my writing, but the day was punctuated by strange occurrences. My camera, which I had brought along in hopes of capturing the forest's beauty, inexplicably recorded blurry, ghostly images. In one particularly disturbing photograph taken at twilight, I thought I saw the faint figure of a woman dressed in traditional Native American attire standing among the trees. Her eyes were sorrowful and filled with a grief that seemed to reach out to me. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the light or something far more sinister, but I knew deep down that I had stumbled upon something that defied explanation. That night, the atmosphere inside the RV grew heavier. I tried to sleep, but my mind raced with the images and sounds of the day. Around midnight, the RV's interior lights began to flicker uncontrollably, and I could hear the sound of soft footsteps outside, pacing slowly along the vehicle's exterior. I lay there, heart pounding, listening to the irregular rhythm of the knocks on the windows, each one a reminder that I was not alone. In the darkness, my mind conjured visions of the ghostly woman from my photographs and the tragic stories of injustice that had long been whispered among the local tribes. The next morning, determined to uncover the truth, I decided to visit the abandoned cabin near my campsite. The structure was in ruins, a skeletal frame that once might have been a gathering place or a homestead. Inside, the air was thick with dust and memories. As I rummaged through scattered papers and faded photographs, I discovered a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The letters, written in a careful, deliberate hand, detailed the life of a Native American woman named Ayanna. They spoke of betrayal, loss, and a deep-seated desire for vengeance against those who had wronged her people. With each word I read, a sense of guilt and sorrow washed over me, as if I were somehow connected to these long-forgotten tragedies. The evidence in the cabin sent a chill through my soul. I began to suspect that my family's history might be intertwined with this dark past. Memories of hushed conversations and evasive glances at family gatherings resurfaced in my mind. Could it be that my own ancestors had played a role in the events that led to Ayanna's untimely death? The thought was unbearable, yet it compelled me to dig deeper. Every corner of that dilapidated cabin seemed to echo with the cries of a long-forgotten injustice. And the more I uncovered, the more I felt the oppressive weight of history bearing down on me. Over the next few days, the supernatural occurrences intensified. Late at night, I began to experience vivid visions of Ayanna wandering through the forest. In these dreams, she was a figure of both beauty and terror, a spectral embodiment of sorrow, with eyes that seemed to plead for recognition and absolution. During waking hours, I caught glimpses of her among the trees, always at the edge of my vision. One evening, as I sat outside the RV recording my thoughts, I heard her voice, a soft, mournful whisper that seemed to speak directly to me, urging me to confront the truth of the past. The RV itself became a battleground for strange phenomena. Electrical surges would cause the interior lights to flicker and die, plunging me into momentary darkness punctuated by the sound of distant, anguished cries. I began to notice that objects in the RV would move on their own. A mug slid off the table without cause, and a photograph of my family was inexplicably turned face down. These unsettling occurrences shattered any illusion of safety, and I found myself oscillating between a desperate desire to flee and an equally powerful compulsion to uncover the secrets that bound me to this place. As my nights grew longer and the isolation deepened, I started to document everything in meticulous detail in my journal. I recorded the timings of the whispers, the locations of the footprints, and even transcribed the eerie messages that mysteriously appeared on scraps of paper. Each entry was a plea for clarity, a desperate attempt to piece together the puzzle of Ayanna's tragic story and my own connection to it. In the quiet solitude of those long nights, the line between reality and the supernatural began to blur. One particularly stormy night, as the wind howled through the trees and rain lashed against the RV's windows, the supernatural energy reached a fever pitch. I had barricaded myself inside the RV, clutching my journal as thunder roared overhead. Suddenly, the door burst open with a violent gust of wind, and I saw her, the spectral figure of Ayana, in all her tragic glory. She floated at the threshold, her eyes brimming with a sorrow that was almost palpable, her presence both a warning and a plea. I felt an overwhelming mix of terror and empathy, as though her anguish was now my burden to bear. In that charged moment, I realized that the ghost was not merely an apparition, but an active force seeking resolution. With trembling hands, I spoke into the storm. "Ayana, I want to help. I need to know the truth. Tell me what must be done." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind and my own ragged breathing. Then, as if in response, the spectral figure advanced slowly, her form shifting with the storm's fury. The air around me grew frigid, and I felt a force pushing against my chest as though the very weight of her sorrow was trying to crush me. The encounter left me shaken to the core. In the aftermath of that night, I resolved to embrace the painful journey of uncovering my family's hidden history. The storm eventually subsided, and with it, Ayana's presence receded into the shadows of the forest. But the echoes of that confrontation lingered in every creak of the RV and every rustle of the leaves. I spent the following days retracing my steps, returning to the ruined cabin and scouring the surrounding woods for any clue that might explain the connection between my lineage and the tragic tale of Ayana. My investigation led me to a local historical society in a small town just outside the forest. There, in the brittle pages of archival records, I uncovered documents that hinted at a dark chapter in our region's history. An account of betrayal and violence against Native Americans during a period of rapid settlement. To my dismay, I found that my own great-grandfather's name appeared in these records as a key figure in the events that led to the massacre. The revelation was a crushing blow. I felt as if the weight of centuries of guilt and injustice were now resting squarely on my shoulders. Returning to the forest, I now carried not only the physical evidence of my family's past, but also an inner resolve to seek redemption. Each night, the apparitions of Ayana became less chaotic, her spectral visits shifting from violent outbursts to mournful, sorrowful encounters. It was as though by acknowledging the truth and bearing the burden of my ancestors' sins, I was slowly helping to ease her tormented spirit. One final fateful night arrived, a moonlit evening that held the promise of both resolution and reckoning. I decided to spend the night in the dilapidated cabin, determined to confront the ghost once and for all. With only my journal, a flickering lantern, and a heart brimming with trepidation, I settled into a creaking wooden chair. As midnight approached, the air grew eerily still. The temperature dropped sharply, and I could feel a presence filling the cramped space of the cabin. Then, as if emerging from the shadows of time itself, Ayana appeared. This time, she was not a chaotic storm of spectral energy, but a serene, sorrowful figure who exuded an undeniable sense of longing for peace. Her eyes met mine, and in that silent exchange I felt her anguish. A deep-seated grief born of injustice and loss. I spoke softly. "I know what you suffered. I carry the burden of those who came before me. I will tell your story so that the truth is known and your spirit may finally rest." Her gaze held a flicker of something like gratitude, and for a long, charged moment, the room was filled with a profound silence, as if the weight of history itself was being acknowledged. In the days that followed, the supernatural disturbances gradually subsided. The cabin, once a nexus of sorrow and spectral fury, began to feel like a solemn shrine, a place where the past and the present met in quiet understanding. I left the forest with a heavy heart, yet also with a newfound sense of purpose. I returned to the city, not to bury my memories, but to transform them into a narrative that honored the truth of what I had witnessed and learned. I have since published a book detailing my journey, a story of guilt, redemption, and the haunting persistence of history. Readers have told me that my words seem to echo with the sorrow and the quiet resilience of that moonlit night in Chippewa National Forest. I still wake at times to the sound of distant whispers, or see a shadow flicker at the edge of my vision. And for a moment, I am transported back to that lonely cabin and the spectral eyes of Ayanna. But I have learned to carry that burden with a solemn grace, knowing that acknowledging the past is the first step toward healing. Every now and then, when the night is particularly still, I drive out to that remote clearing, park the RV, and sit in silence beneath the ancient pines. I leave a small bouquet of wildflowers and a copy of my book near the ruined cabin, a quiet tribute to a spirit whose tragedy was intertwined with my own. And as I sit there, the forest whispers back, a gentle, enduring echo of voices long silenced by time, but now finally heard. This is my story, a journey into the heart of darkness and the fragile hope for redemption. It is a tale of confronting the past, of seeking truth in the face of relentless sorrow, and of finding a way to forgive not just the actions of my ancestors, but also myself. In the end, the ghost of Ayanna was not a demon to be exorcised by fear, but a wounded soul in desperate need of acknowledgement. And as I continue on my path, I hold fast to the belief that even the deepest scars of history can, one day, begin to heal. My nights in Chippewa National Forest taught me that isolation is a double-edged sword. While it can expose you to the darkest corners of your own soul, it also provides the space to confront them, to understand them, and eventually, to transcend them. The forest remains a silent witness to my transformation. Its trees and whispering winds a constant reminder of the power of truth and the enduring resilience of the human spirit. Now, whenever I hear the wind rustle through the pines or catch a fleeting glimpse of a figure at the edge of the darkness, I no longer tremble with fear. Instead, I remember that one moonlit night in an abandoned cabin, where I faced the ghost of the past and found within myself the strength to embrace the future. And that, above all, is the most profound victory of all. My name is Jared Thompson. I'm 34 years old, and this happened in late autumn during a weekend trip to Voyageurs National Park, Minnesota, a trip I had hoped would be a peaceful escape from the grind of everyday life. I had always prided myself on being cautious and prepared, so when I organized our RV trip with 3 of my closest friends, Emily, Carson, and Olivia, I made sure every detail was planned. What none of us could have foreseen was that our search for solace would soon plunge us into a nightmare drawn straight from Ojibwe legends. We set out on a crisp October morning, the sky a clear, unsettling blue as our battered RV rumbled down isolated back roads. Our destination was a secluded lakeside campsite in Voyageurs, far from the tourist-packed areas, where dense forests crept up to the water's edge. I drove, focused on the road ahead, while the others bantered inside the cramped interior. Emily, with her fearless spark, kept teasing Carson about his habit of downplaying every potential danger with humor. Olivia, ever the quiet researcher, leafed through a thick journal filled with notes on local folklore, particularly the grim legends of the Wendigo. The RV itself was a relic of better days. Its engine creaked with each acceleration, and the heater struggled against the biting cold that seeped into our bones. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of anxiety as I maneuvered along the winding roads, the headlights piercing the gathering dusk. Our supplies were modest, and we had even run short on a few essentials, a fact that would soon prove to be as ominous as the silence that enveloped the forest. When we finally reached our campsite, the land seemed to hold its breath. The lake lay eerily still, a dark mirror reflecting the bare trees and the lingering light of a fading sun. I felt the weight of isolation immediately. I could sense that nature here was indifferent, even hostile, a fitting stage for the horror that was to come. That first night, we gathered around a small, crackling campfire. The conversation meandered from nostalgic memories to local ghost stories, with Carson tossing out quips to lighten the mood. "Come on, Jared," he said with a smirk. "If a Wendigo comes by, I'm pretty sure it won't find our RV particularly appetizing." His jokes made us laugh, but I couldn't shake the underlying tension as a cold wind whispered through the trees. I remember staring into the dancing flames, recalling a passage from Olivia's research. The Wendigo, a creature born from greed and starvation, was said to roam these forests, an embodiment of the darkness that dwells within man and nature alike. I tried to dismiss the thought as mere myth, but a gnawing dread settled in my gut. The following morning, we discovered the first sign that something was horribly off. Outside the RV, near the edge of our camp, were enormous, oddly shaped footprints. They were too large for any animal we knew of, and their spacing was unnervingly deliberate, as if a giant, clumsy predator had just wandered by. Emily crouched down to inspect them, her eyes wide. "This isn't from any bear I've seen," she whispered, more to herself than to any of us. I suggested we mark the prints and notify park rangers, but our communication gear sputtered uselessly, a reminder of our unreliable equipment. We were on our own, trapped in a wilderness that seemed to have turned against us. That evening, as dusk settled over the lake, an unearthly silence fell. The wind had died down, replaced by an oppressive stillness that made every rustle and creak of the forest sound magnified. I sat with Carson by the fire, both of us lost in thought. Then, without warning, faint, almost imperceptible whispers drifted through the darkness. They were not quite voices, but sounds that suggested sorrow, despair, and a warning from beyond. Carson tried to laugh it off, but his forced humor faltered as his eyes darted around nervously. The following night, while I lay in the small bunk of the RV, I was roused by a low, mournful howl that echoed from the woods. I peered out the window to see flickering lights among the trees, as if something, or someone, was watching us from the darkness. It wasn't long before Olivia, ever observant, insisted on investigating. "I saw something," she told us in a hushed tone, "near those trees by the water. I think it's connected to what I found in these old Ojibwe records." Her research had long warned of a malevolent presence that stalked the isolated wilderness, a spirit that could twist into the form of a towering, gaunt creature with sunken eyes and a skeletal frame. The legend of the Wendigo was more than just a campfire tale here. It was a curse waiting to be unleashed. Reluctantly, a small group, Emily, Olivia, and I, decided to check the area. Carson stayed behind with the RV, his face a mixture of worry and disbelief. The forest loomed ahead, its trees standing like silent sentinels. We moved cautiously, our flashlights cutting thin beams through the murk of the woods. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth, set our hearts racing. It was near a stand of ancient pines that we came upon symbols etched into the bark of a tree, strange markings that Olivia's research identified as part of a ritual meant to appease, or perhaps ward off, the Wendigo. My pulse quickened as I traced the symbols with a trembling finger. The markings were intricate and unsettling, a blend of Ojibwe motifs and cryptic patterns that spoke of ancient, forbidden lore. Suddenly, a distant, blood-curdling scream shattered the silence, a sound that belonged to a banshee from the darkest corners of folklore. I froze. the air turning bitterly cold as if the forest itself had exhaled a warning. Emily clutched my arm, her eyes wide with terror, while Olivia's face paled as she muttered, "It's here. It must be." We turned back, our footsteps hurried and heavy on the leaf-strewn path. The forest, which had seemed like an endless maze moments before, now felt like a trap closing in around us. As we neared our campsite, the shadows seemed to twist and shift, as if alive. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something impossibly tall and emaciated. A figure with sunken eyes and a gaunt, twisted frame. The creature stood silently among the trees, its eyes burning with an otherworldly light watching us. In that moment, every tale I'd ever heard of the Wendigo surged to life in my mind. The creature began to stalk us, moving with a disquieting, unnatural grace. It wasn't content to merely haunt us from afar. It was aggressive, its presence exuding a raw, primal malice. I felt an overwhelming urge to run, but my feet were rooted in terror. Back at the RV, panic had set in among those who remained. Carson, usually the class clown, was now visibly shaken, his jokes replaced by frantic attempts to secure the vehicle and our meager supplies. Tensions within our small group began to crack. Emily argued that we should pack up and leave immediately, while Olivia insisted on documenting every detail, convinced that understanding this entity might be our only hope for survival. "We have to do something," I barked, trying to assert some control over the situation. "We can't just sit here waiting for it to tear us apart." My voice echoed in the cramped space of the RV as we debated our next move. The night wore on with relentless dread. The creature's presence loomed large even when we were all huddled inside. I found myself haunted by the memory of that towering figure, its eyes, its hollow grin, and I could hardly sleep. Every shadow outside the window seemed to whisper of impending doom. At dawn, the situation escalated. We discovered that Carson's makeshift barricades around the RV had been tampered with. Scratches and deep gouges in the metal that looked disturbingly like claw marks. Carson's face drained of color as he inspected the damage. "It's like it wanted us out," he murmured, his voice shaking. In a desperate bid for answers, Olivia took it upon herself to revisit the area where we'd seen the symbols. She believed that if we could decipher the markings, we might learn how to repel or even appease the malevolent force. Emily and I accompanied her, our flashlights barely piercing the murky gloom. Olivia's fingers trembled as she traced the patterns, reading aloud in a hushed, reverent tone about ancient rites and forbidden bargains with dark spirits. "It says here," she whispered, "that only by offering something of great personal value can one hope to break the curse." The idea chilled me to the bone. What could be valuable enough to appease such an evil? And even if we did manage to perform the ritual, would it be enough to halt the relentless pursuit of the creature? That evening, the entity made its move. As we sat around the RV, trying to muster some semblance of calm, the creature appeared at the edge of the clearing. It moved with a predatory stealth, its form shifting in the gloom, almost as if it were made of the shadows themselves. In a heartbeat it lunged. I felt a searing pain as it struck Carson, and his cry echoed through the night. A sound that has since haunted my dreams. I rushed to him, but it was too late. The creature had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind a trail of blood and despair. Panic erupted among us. Emily was inconsolable, tears streaming down her face, while Olivia's determination hardened into a steely resolve. "We have no choice," Olivia said, her voice trembling with both fear and fury. "We must perform the ritual. It's our only chance." I hesitated, torn between the instinct to flee and the need to fight back against this monstrous curse. In that moment, every decision carried the weight of life and death. I knew that if we didn't act, more of us would suffer the same brutal fate as Carson. Gathering what little courage I had left, I led Emily and Olivia to the spot where the symbols were etched into the tree. The cold night air seemed to pulse with an ancient energy, and every rustle of the leaves felt like a sinister whisper. Olivia retrieved a small, worn notebook filled with notes and translations of the Ojibwe rituals. According to her research, the offering had to be deeply personal, something that symbolized our innermost self. I glanced at Emily, whose eyes were red-rimmed and filled with desperation. She hesitated before finally producing a small locket, an heirloom passed down through her family that held a faded photograph of her mother. "This," she said softly, "is all I have left of her." In that moment, the locket became more than just a trinket. It was a symbol of hope and remembrance against the encroaching darkness. As Olivia began the incantation in a language none of us fully understood, I felt the forest around us grow unnaturally still. The wind died, and the only sound was the pounding of our hearts in our ears. Shadows seemed to coalesce around us, swirling in patterns that defied explanation. I felt as though we were standing on the very edge of a precipice between this world and something far more sinister. For what felt like an eternity, we chanted and offered our personal tokens, my own being, my very will to survive. I closed my eyes and focused on the memories of my family, the warmth of home, and the determination that had always seen me through life's darkest moments. I felt a strange energy build within me, as though the very air was charged with the hopes and fears of all those who had come before. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the oppressive presence seemed to recede. The howling wind returned, the forest stirred once more, and I dared to open my eyes. But the relief was short-lived. Across the clearing, emerging from the depths of the darkness, the creature reappeared. This time, its eyes burning brighter, its movements more desperate and enraged. In that final confrontation, terror and determination collided. I grabbed a sturdy branch and, along with Emily and Olivia, charged toward the creature. It attacked with a fury born of centuries of malice, its claws slashing through the air. In the chaos, I managed to land a blow, but the creature retaliated with savage, unholy strength. I watched in horror as Emily was thrown aside, her locket skittering across the ground, its delicate chain snapping under the strain. The struggle was brutal and unrelenting. I fought not just for my own survival, but for the memory of those who had fallen, and the hope that we might still escape this nightmare. Olivia's incantations rang out in the cold night, a desperate plea to forces beyond our understanding. Slowly, as if drawn by some ancient force, the creature began to falter. Its movements grew sluggish, and the burning in its eyes dimmed. With one final desperate surge, I managed to drive the branch deep into its chest. There was a sound, a keening, heart-wrenching wail as the creature crumpled to the ground, dissipating into the shadows from whence it came. The silence that followed was profound, a stark contrast to the chaos of moments before. I sank to my knees, blood and sweat mingling as I tried to comprehend what had just transpired. Emily lay motionless, and though Olivia rushed to her side, the damage was too severe. Carson's fate, too, weighed heavily on my mind as the grim realization set in. We had lost someone dear in the name of survival. In the aftermath, the forest seemed to reclaim its calm, though an undercurrent of sorrow lingered in every whisper of wind. We gathered what supplies we could salvage from the ruined RV and the clearing where the ritual had taken place, knowing that our ordeal was not truly over. The ancient evil, though repelled for now, might return, its hunger unquenched and its malevolence undiminished. I left Voyager National Park forever changed. The isolation, the harrowing encounters, and the loss of friends left scars that would never fully heal. I now carry with me not only the memory of that night, but also a solemn understanding of the darkness that lurks in the wild places of our world. The Wendigo, as the legends foretold, was not merely a myth. It was a living terror, a remnant of a time when nature and spirit walked hand in hand in a dance of life and death. Even now, whenever the wind howls through the trees or I catch a glimpse of a shadow moving where it shouldn't, I'm reminded of that dreadful autumn night. My name is Jared Thompson. I'm 34 years old, and I survived that fateful weekend in Voyagers National Park. I survived not because I was invincible, but because in the face of unspeakable horror, we must all find within ourselves the strength to fight back, even when the darkness seems to be winning. The scars of that encounter serve as a permanent reminder. Sometimes, the most dangerous predators are not the ones that lurk in the natural world, but the supernatural manifestations of our deepest fears. And as I drive my old RV along the lonely roads of northern Minnesota, I can't help but wonder, are we ever truly safe when the past refuses to remain buried in the depths of the wilderness? My name is Mark. I'm 42 years old, and this is the story of a trip that nearly cost me everything. It all began on a crisp October morning when my two friends, Jenna and Liam, and I set out in my old RV toward Chippewa National Forest in Minnesota. I had always prided myself on being resourceful and prepared, but nothing could have readied me for the darkness that lay ahead. We'd planned this escape from our urban routines, a weekend retreat to reconnect with nature and, perhaps, with ourselves. I'd spent weeks tinkering with the RV, making sure every tool and spare part was in place. Yet, even as we pulled away from the city, I had a nagging feeling that our equipment was already on shaky ground. The RV's engine had sputtered twice during the drive, and the generator, which we'd hoped would keep our evenings warm, had been making odd, persistent noises. I shrugged these off at the time as the quirks of an aging vehicle. Jenna, a pragmatic skeptic in her late 30s, had been quiet on the drive, her dark eyes fixed on the passing trees as if searching for something unseen. Despite her outward calm, I knew she harbored a deep-seated fear of the unknown. She'd scoffed at local legends when we'd discussed them, insisting that logic and science ruled nature. Liam, on the other hand, was the opposite. An impulsive adventurer in his early 30s, always ready with a joke and a dare. His charm often lightened the mood, but his penchant for risk sometimes escalated our conflicts. We arrived at our chosen campsite just as the sun dipped behind the towering pines. Chippewa National Forest spread out before us, vast and untamed, a playground for those seeking isolation and a brush with the wild. I parked the RV near a small rocky clearing where the sound of a distant creek mingled with the rustling leaves. As dusk settled, we set up our meager camp, lit a small fire, and tried to shake off the chill brought on by the failing heater. That first night, as I sat outside warming my hands, I began to notice unsettling things. The wind carried odd sounds, distant, childlike giggles mixed with low, mournful cries that seemed to echo through the trees. At first, I dismissed them as tricks of the night, but Jenna's furrowed brow and Liam's uneasy glances told me otherwise. I tried to reassure both of them, attributing the sounds to the isolation of the forest and the peculiar acoustics of our surroundings. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The next morning, we discovered that our generator had completely died. With the chill in the air and no immediate fix, our plans for a comfortable retreat were already off to a rough start. While Liam rummaged through the storage for spare parts, Jenna wandered off to explore the immediate area. Later, she returned with a disturbing find: a series of strange carvings etched deep into the bark of a large pine. The symbols were unlike anything I'd seen before: jagged lines and spirals that resembled markings from Native American lore. Jenna explained that they reminded her of stories about the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit known to prey on the vulnerable and insatiably hungry for human flesh. Her rational mind struggled to reconcile these legends with reality, yet the markings stirred something deep within her. That evening, as darkness fell again, the forest seemed to come alive with eerie whispers. Liam, ever the thrill-seeker, insisted on venturing further from the RV to capture the unsettling sounds on his phone. "This is going to be epic footage," he said, flashing a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. I protested, urging caution, but his enthusiasm was infectious. I followed reluctantly, my flashlight cutting a narrow path through the dense woods. Every snapped twig and rustle of leaves made my heart pound faster, the silence between us filled with unspoken dread. It wasn't long before Liam stopped dead in his tracks. "Mark, do you see that?" he whispered, pointing toward a gap between two massive trees. There, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. A dark, gaunt silhouette that moved with an unnerving stillness. The figure looked disturbingly human, yet its outline seemed to waver as if it were made of smoke. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the light or something far more sinister. "Let's get back to the RV," I ordered, my voice betraying none of my inner turmoil, though my palms were slick with sweat. Back at the RV, tension simmered. Jenna's earlier discovery and Liam's capture of the shadowed figure had fractured the fragile calm among us. As we huddled in the cramped space, debating what we'd seen, our disagreements about safety and risk management flared. I argued for a rational explanation, while Liam's insistence on confronting the unknown clashed with Jenna's mounting apprehension. The night wore on, with the oppressive sounds of the forest pressing in around us. The next day, while trying to repair the generator, I found myself increasingly on edge. The forest seemed to whisper secrets from every direction. Our attempts at a rational explanation faltered when we stumbled upon more inexplicable phenomena. A patch of ground scorched as if by fire without any trace of an actual blaze. A cold, unnatural fog that drifted low over the trees, and fleeting glimpses of figures darting in the periphery of our vision. Late that afternoon, Jenna, determined to uncover more about the markings, visited an old, abandoned ranger station not far from our campsite. I stayed behind with Liam, the weight of unease pressing upon me as I waited. Hours later, Jenna returned, clutching a worn leather-bound journal she had found tucked away in a dusty drawer. The journal contained accounts of Wendigo sightings and detailed descriptions of a creature that stalked the forest. An embodiment of greed and hunger, a spirit that transformed those it touched into monsters. The journal's pages spoke of violence and death, recounting how the Wendigo's presence was often preceded by strange markings and unexplained phenomena. As Jenna read aloud a particularly grim entry, the sound of low, guttural growls echoed in the distance, shaking us to our core. That night, a raging storm descended upon us. The wind howled like a chorus of lost souls, and rain battered the RV with relentless fury. In the chaos, the Wendigo made its move. I was jolted awake by a violent thump against the side of the RV. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside into the storm. The rain blurred my vision as I searched for the source of the disturbance, only to find a large, twisted silhouette looming in the darkness. It was unlike the earlier figure. A hulking, grotesque form with eyes that burned like embers, its limbs contorted in unnatural angles. I stumbled back inside and shouted for Jenna and Liam. The RV shook violently as if the creature itself had struck it with force. In the midst of the storm's fury, we huddled together, the air thick with terror and the realization that this was no hallucination or trick of the light. It was the Wendigo, a living embodiment of ancient evil. The creature's presence was violently tangible, its malevolence palpable in every thunderclap and every flash of lightning. Liam, ever the impulsive one, insisted on fighting back. "We can't just sit here and wait to be devoured," he yelled, brandishing a heavy iron tool from our makeshift repair kit. Jenna, pale and trembling, clutched the journal as if it were a talisman. "We need to understand it, to use its own legends against it," she whispered, though her voice wavered with fear. I, caught between my rational mind and the primal instinct to survive, made a split-second decision to lead us in a desperate bid for escape. We piled into the RV as the Wendigo began to circle our campsite, its guttural growls merging with the roar of the storm. The creature's attacks grew more ferocious, and as the RV's battered frame shuddered under each blow, I realized that our fragile sanctuary was crumbling. A sharp, agonized cry cut through the clamor of the storm. A cry from Liam, who had been thrown against the interior wall when the creature slammed into the RV with brutal force. I raced to Liam's side, but it was too late. His eyes, wide with shock and pain, met mine briefly before he slumped, unresponsive. The loss of my friend ignited a surge of desperate anger. With Jenna's help, I managed to start the engine, an achievement that felt miraculous given our dwindling supplies and the failing RV. We didn't stop to mourn. Survival was our only thought. As I drove through the relentless storm, Jenna sat in the passenger seat, clutching the journal and whispering the legends of the Wendigo as if they might offer a clue to our escape. The roads were slick and treacherous, winding through the forest in a maze of darkness and rain. Every bump and swerve was a reminder of the monstrous presence that we had left behind, and the knowledge that the Wendigo might still be following us like a shadow. Hours later, as the storm began to subside, I noticed that the oppressive weight of dread had lessened. We'd managed to reach a narrow, winding road that led toward a small, isolated town. The town's lights twinkled in the distance like a promise of safety, though I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal was far from over. In the town, we sought refuge in a modest motel on the outskirts, a place that smelled faintly of antiseptic and old wood. As we sat in the dimly lit room, Jenna pored over the journal, deciphering entries that hinted at ways to ward off the Wendigo. According to local lore, the creature's power was tied to greed and the corruption of nature. A ritual of purification, using salt and sacred herbs, might repel its malevolent influence. I listened, my mind racing with the possibility that we could somehow use this ancient wisdom to protect ourselves. Despite the relative safety of the town, the memory of the Wendigo's violent attack haunted me. I couldn't shake the image of its ember-like eyes and twisted limbs as I lay awake in the quiet of the motel room. I recalled the sound of Liam's cry, a sound that would forever be etched in my memory. The loss of my friend left a void that nothing could fill, and the realization that our brushes with the supernatural had exacted a terrible toll settled heavily in my heart. In the days that followed, Jenna and I remained in the motel while the authorities were alerted to our situation. Although our story sounded almost too fantastical to be believed, local residents nodded knowingly when we recounted our encounter. They spoke in hushed tones of similar legends. The cursed presence that lurked in the deep woods, striking down those who ventured too far. Even as I tried to rationalize what had happened, a part of me acknowledged that the Wendigo was very real, a dangerous, predatory force that thrived on isolation and fear. In the quiet moments before dawn, I took long walks along the town's edge, the memory of the forest mingling with the cold morning air. Jenna, ever the skeptic now forced to confront the supernatural, began to research more about the indigenous lore that had shaped these legends. Her determination to find answers was both inspiring and heartbreaking, a reminder that even the most logical minds can be shattered by the inexplicable. One misty morning, as I walked by a small lake on the town's outskirts, I noticed something odd. A set of footprints near the water's edge that didn't belong to any human I knew. They were elongated, with a claw-like impression at the tip, as if made by a creature both man and beast. A chill ran down my spine. I returned to the motel and shared my discovery with Jenna, whose face went pale as she recalled an entry from the journal, "When the Wendigo roams, its mark remains, a legacy of hunger and despair." That day, I resolved that we couldn't live in constant fear. We gathered what supplies we could from local stores, salt, sage, and other herbs mentioned in the journal, and prepared for a final confrontation. Jenna was meticulous in following the ancient instructions, while I struggled to reconcile the logical part of my mind with the visceral terror that the Wendigo had instilled in me. We returned to the forest at twilight, our hearts pounding in unison with the rhythm of our cautious steps. The familiar path was transformed under the setting sun, bathed in blood-red hues that made every shadow seem alive. In a clearing not far from our original campsite, we set up a makeshift ritual circle, following the journal's directions to the letter. Jenna sprinkled salt around us, and I arranged bundles of sage in a line. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of the forest floor, heightened our senses as we waited. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted, and the air grew thick with an unseen menace. Then, in the distance, I saw it again. A hulking silhouette moving with a predatory grace. The Wendigo. Its eyes burned with an otherworldly glow, and its presence was as undeniable as it was horrifying. The creature paused at the edge of our circle, as if assessing our preparations. For a moment, time stood still. I could feel the creature's gaze, a malevolent force that seemed to strip away all pretense of safety. Then, with a guttural roar that shook the ground beneath us, it lunged forward. I felt the surge of adrenaline as I stepped into action, my mind a blur of instinct and memory. Jenna chanted the ancient words she had deciphered from the journal, her voice trembling yet resolute. The air around us seemed to crackle with energy as the sacred herbs and salt formed an invisible barrier. The Wendigo's advance faltered as it neared our circle, its claws scraping the ground, leaving marks that seethed with unnatural energy. In that moment of confrontation, I realized that survival depended on both the modern skills I'd honed over years of outdoor adventures and the ancient wisdom that Jenna had revived. I clutched a heavy tool, prepared to fight if necessary, but mostly I stood firm, determined to see the ritual through. Time and again, the creature attacked. Each assault met with our combined efforts, Jenna's fervent chants and the tangible power of the ritual, and my own desperate physical resistance. The battle was both psychological and physical, a dance of light and shadow in the heart of the forest. Finally, as the first rays of dawn broke through the canopy, the Wendigo's form began to waver. With one last anguished howl, it retreated into the depths of the forest, leaving us battered and shaken but alive. I stood there in the clearing, the early morning light casting long shadows as the remnants of our confrontation faded into silence. Jenna's eyes were red from crying, and I felt the sting of loss more acutely than ever. Liam was gone, an irreplaceable friend whose memory would forever haunt these woods. But in that loss, I also recognized the fierce determination that had driven us to stand against a force that defied reason. In the weeks that followed, I returned to the forest alone, drawn by a need to understand and perhaps find some semblance of closure. I retraced our steps, examining the carvings, the scorched earth, and the scattered relics of our encounter. With every visit, I felt the lingering presence of the Wendigo, a reminder that nature holds secrets too vast and dark for the human mind to fully comprehend. Even now, as I write these words, the memory of that harrowing weekend is as vivid as the day it unfolded. The old RV, with its creaks and groans, became a symbol of our vulnerability and resilience. Chippewa National Forest, with its ancient trees and whispered legends, taught me that sometimes survival isn't about conquering the wilderness, but understanding the delicate balance between man and the supernatural. Jenna has since dedicated herself to researching indigenous lore and working with local communities to preserve the ancient stories that once warned of creatures like the Wendigo. Her transformation from skeptic to believer was a journey filled with both heartbreak and hope, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, the human spirit can adapt and learn. As for me, I continue to wander the borderlands between rationality and myth, forever changed by the night I faced a creature born of greed, despair, and the hunger of an ancient curse. I have come to understand that some forces in nature are not meant to be defeated, but respected, their legends woven into the fabric of our collective memory. The forest still calls to me, sometimes in the soft murmur of the wind, sometimes in the distant echo of a long-forgotten cry. And though I have learned to live with the terror that once nearly claimed me, I carry with me the knowledge that in the isolated depths of the wilderness, the line between myth and reality is perilously thin. Every time I hear a rustle in the trees or see an unexpected shadow dance in the moonlight, I remember Liam's smile and the final defiant stand we made together against an ancient evil. I know now that survival is not just about physical endurance, it is about confronting the darkness within and around us and finding the courage to carry on despite the odds. This journey into the heart of the northern woods left scars that time may never fully heal, but it also imparted a profound lesson, that in facing the unimaginable, we discover the true strength of our spirit and the enduring power of hope amid the shadows. And so, with every step I take in the forest's embrace, I honor the memory of those lost and keep watch over the fragile boundary between our world and the dark mysteries that lie beyond.